and elsewhere, and how we might defeat it. There are seasoned men among us who have faced the others. They are wildlings, and sworn men of the Night's Watch, and northerners, and chief among them the Lord Commander himself. The king turned to Sir Barristan. "Bring them in, sir." And so they came. Samwell Tarly first, who stared at his boots as he recounted what had happened on the Fist, and the other he had slain, then Jory and Alyn after him, and Lord Dustin, Lord Umber, and Harry on Carstark, whose words seemed meant for Rob's ears, who spoke with grief and anger both. Benjen Stark came last of all, at last to tell of all he had seen since his ranging, in the tones of a soldier reporting to his commander. Lord Arryn and Lord Baratheon showed little emotion on their faces, but Edmure listened to every word in horror. "Gods," he breathed, "we cannot defeat them with sheer numbers, even if we put Valyrian steel and obsidian daggers in the hand of every man. We cannot." The king agreed, "and each man who falls against them, rises as an enemy unless they are burned to ash. Our foes are an ancient evil, we can say that and know it, but we cannot allow it to take away our hopes. The dragons will do what mere men cannot, Edmure. It has been prophesied." "A man must know his enemy," Lord Arryn said, frowning. "What do we know of them?" "They are deadly, they seem to come from these lands far to the north, they attack when it is cold, or bring the cold with them." He listed off each as though it pained him. "But where are they? How do we marshal our forces against them? How long do we wait here and wait for them to fall upon us?" Jon shook his head. "We can't wait. We've waited too long already. They're in the sea, my lord, and the haunted forest has as many wights as trees. These beasts. These dragons," Lord Stannis drummed his fingers on the table. "They will be useful. Have their riders used them to scout?" He does not know, Jon realized. He was too recently arrived to see what was plain before every man. Princess Daenerys could not bring her dragon beyond the wall. "Neither could I with mine," Aegon said. Good, Jon thought. There was no use in lying. Stannis frowned. "And what of the third?" "My aunt has tamed it too and rides it when she wishes." Rob's eyes were on the prince at every mention of his wife. Lord Stannis looked like he might have snorted. "I saw it with my own eyes. Her bond with the dragons is unlike any other rider that has come before." That had struck Jon as more than a little queer. He had only seen Daenerys ride the Black One. "And yet the dragon will not cross?" Lord Stannis asked. "The last dragon died a century and a half ago, and most of the dragon lore was lost with it," the king said. "They will cross soon, cousin, have no fear on that account." Cousin. The word spoke volumes. Jon was grateful at least he did not have to wrangle dragons. Only thousands of men, and 300 miles of wall. Lord Edmure moved uneasily in his seat. "The princess has a fine mastery of the dragons. My lady wife can attest to the same. Perhaps Princess Daenerys may come before us now, and share our counsel." The eyes shifted to Robb. "Lady Stark is unwell," he said. Those words spoke volumes too. "She has the mother's stomach." A sudden silence descended over the table. Lord Edmure was the first to rush into it with congratulations. And then each man followed, offering their congratulations, one after the other, which Robb accepted with a tight smile, his lips pursed. When Jon dared to glance at Aegon, a similar look was on his face, as though his whole body was clenched. Afterwards, Jon sought out his cousin so they may toast for his child to come, as they all those months ago for his son. He'd been cautious of being seen too often among his kin, but Robb's manner troubled him, and so they sat together in Jon's rooms, flagons of ale before them with some dark bread, which neither of them touched. He remembered the day Robb had first learned he was to be the father. They were walking the wall together, both green boys, when Daenerys found him, and after she was gone Robb had pulled him into a tight embrace, and been so happy there were tears in his eyes. Jon would never hold a child of his own blood in his arms, but he had tried to tell himself then that he would love Robb's son as though he were his own, and visit Winterfell often so he may watch him grow. He had not understood then that a black brother had no cousins, that he would not be permitted to leave the wall for years so he may better forget the life he left behind. Perhaps it will be another son this time. Cregan will be pleased to have a little brother to care for, I'm sure. Jon smiled, though it did not touch his cousin. "Robb, these are good tidings and we are in sore need of them. Good tidings. There was a bitter turn to his mouth. This child. I can't begin to think of what world he will born to. By all rights my wife should be safe in Winterfell. His voice broke off. I don't want her here. I am tired of this endless talk and this cold and swallowing my pride before your brother. What did Aegon do? He asked, though he knew it would be easier for him not to know. The Night's Watch takes no part, he reminded himself, not in matters between lords and princes, nor cousins and brothers. Robb shook his head. I shouldn't have said that. I just feel angry. Angry and ill. I feel angry too, and for no reason I can name, Jon admitted. But you must set aside your anger if you can, at least when it comes to this. You have been blessed. Robb bit his lip, and suddenly Jon could see he was holding back tears. Ned Stark, Jon began, trying the words, seeing if he had the courage to say it. Died a noble death. He went in peace, and he wasn't alone. There must have been something in his tone that made Robb suspect these were more than simple words of condolences. Willam Dustin said father was dead and his body growing cold when he found him. Yes. But Ghost came upon him first. It could not be unsaid now. My uncle was still alive. He was looking up at the weirwood leaves. He wasn't frightened or pained, and Ghost remained with him until the very end. Robb stared at him, and Jon found himself too scared to try to puzzle the meaning of that look. You saw it in a wolf dream, he said, after what felt like an eternal silence. Yes, Jon admitted. So, his cousin knew it, and had named it. I dream them too. I don't know when it started, only that I can't remember a time when I didn't know what it was like to see the world through Grey Wind's eyes. Sometimes it happens when I'm awake. I can feel where he is, as surely as I feel my own right arm, and when he feeds, there's hot blood on my tongue. They spoke in the voice of secrets. Who have you spoken to about this? Jon asked. No one. You haven't told Daenerys? No. We hardly speak, he admitted. And yet they had lain together and made a child. Jon could hardly blame him for that. He thought of Ygritte, and the cave. And just as quickly his mind went to the spot outside the Lord Commander's towers where she had died in his arms. The free folk saw it in me. They called me Warg. To some of his sworn brothers it was a curse, meant to demean him as a beastling, a freakish thing not fit to lead men. Rebel, turncloak, bastard, Warg. That was how he would be remembered, if he was remembered at all. Perhaps that is what we are. The direwolf is the sigil of House Stark. I think the wolves were sent to us so we may survive winter. I'm no Stark. Robb wiped his eyes. You have Stark blood, no more and no less than I do. And you did for my father what no living man could. Jon loved his cousin for saying that. But it was Ghost who had done it. Ghost, who was closer than a friend, who was a part of him. And Jon was a man, not a wolf. Wasn't he? Notes. Thank you for your kind comments and support through this story. If everything goes as planned, things will escalate drastically in the next chapter, but I hope to keep some soft, quiet moments despite it and keep the story from getting too dark. Only a short note this time, but I want to say I'm a big fan of Jon in the books, and I clearly think he's a very capable person. He's not immune from the consequences of his decisions, such as Hardham, which will continue to be made clearer, but also when he thinks of him in comparison to Aegon here, I want to point out that it's his voice, and not mine. Thank you once again for everything. Chapter 35, Arya, Bonus Chapter. Notes. This chapter includes descriptions of menstruation. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Arya never remembered Winterfell feeling this small. There had always been new people to talk to, free riders and courtly knights and grizzled old men at arms traveling the King Road south or north. When they ate in the Great Hall, her father always had an extra seat set at his own table, and every day a different man would be asked to join them. One night it would be Veon Poole, and the talk would be coppers and bread stores and servants. The next time it would be Mikken, and her father would listen to him go on about armor and swords and how hot a forge should be and the best way to temper steel. Another day it might be Hullen with his endless horse talk, or Septon Chale from the library, or Jory, or Sir Roderick, or even Old Nan with her stories. Only now, their father wasn't Lord anymore. He was dead, just like Bran, gone away like Robb and Jon and Jory and Alan, like most of the men of Winterfell who would stand guard at their doors and cross swords in the yard and laugh and smile when they caught her in some mischief. Gone like the princess and Sansa and Wyler Mandaeli, who Arya had liked with her long, green braid. Except she might see all of them again one day, but she would never see her father again, never sit with him before the hearth and listen to his voice, never see Bran climb again or practice sword fighting together in secret in the Godswood. They still ate in the Great Hall more often than not, but it wasn't the same, no matter how Gage made her favorite foods to try to cheer her, no matter her mother tried to smile and told her to do her duty. There were few familiar faces across the hall now, though the tables were always full with women and children and old men or young boys too old to go to war. Her father used to say that it was a lord's duty to protect his people. When the hard cruel times come, he would say, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. In winter, we must protect one another, keep each other warm, share our strengths. And so she tried, speaking to the women and inventing names for their babies, playing monsters and maidens and hide the treasure and come into my castle with their children. But no matter what she did, nothing could ease the ache in her heart. Sometimes she found herself even wishing for Sansa. She knew she should have been sad when the news reached them that Haryon Karstark had died, that he was her brother too, but she'd had grief enough only for her father. Rickon was weeping and angry by turns, wild as a winter storm, refusing to eat, crying and screaming most nights. He'd only stopped when he was their mother, and had taken to following her around and clutching at her leg. Now that Haryon was dead, Arya had thought Sansa would come home and it would be good to have someone who wasn't a baby to talk to, but Robb had decided she would stay in Carhold, and marry Haryon's little brother. Arya thought that was unfair and said as much, but Septa Mordane had told her that was the way of things, just like how her mother had married her father when Uncle Brandon died. It didn't seem right all the same. And now Aunt Lyanna was here, and that might have made all the difference, but her aunt was only ever in the crypts or the Godswood, and when she wasn't, she was with Robb's baby. He was a sweet baby, everyone said so, and hardly cried at all, but he was so little still. Her aunt didn't seem to mind. Lyanna seemed to understand everything the baby said, though most of it sounded like gibbering, and never grew bored by his company. Arya never saw her mother nor her aunt cry, though sometimes their eyes would be red in the mornings as though they had only just stopped. As for her, she had cried for her father and for Bran until she thought she couldn't anymore. She cried even in sleep, and come morning she'd wake red-eyed. Sometimes, her tears would turn to anger, and then she could hardly bear to have anyone around her, save for Nymeria. When the princess came to Winterfell, with her uncles Edmure and Brynden and Lord Arryn and all their armies, her mother had sewed her a new, pretty blue dress. But something had come over her to hear the sound of the trumpets outside, heralding their arrival, knowing that no horns would ever blow for her father, and she suddenly felt as wild as Rickon, dropped the heavy bar over her door and refused to come out. Fat Tom had stood guard over the halls where her rooms were that day and asked if she was all right. Septa Mordane's rapt knocking came after, and endless talk of how Arya was shaming them all, before her mother came for her. Hearing her mother ask her to come out was worst of all, but she couldn't bring herself to move, or stop crying. It was hours later that her uncle Edmure came to her door, telling her of how nice it would be to have dinner with her, and didn't she want to look at the dragons. Arya had already seen the dragons in Riverrun, but she was hungry, and embarrassed to think that her uncle might think she was a baby, so at last she'd come out. At first, the tears wouldn't stop, no matter how much she willed it, but now when she thought of her father and Bran, she only felt sick, like there was nothing in her stomach no matter how much she'd eaten or drank. She got that feeling again when her mother came into her room one night, with the lines of grief fresh on her face. Her mother had always been beautiful, beautiful in the way that Arya wished she was, but she had been so pale since Bran and father died, silver running through her auburn hair where there had never been any before. Tonight, she was quiet in a way that was almost frightening, and so when her mother sat with her on the bed, and undid the ribbon in Arya's hair and began to brush it like she used to brush Sansa's, Arya let her without complaint. They sat that way for so long that her eyes began to close. When she began to drift off to sleep, her body fell backwards into her mother's chest and her mother wrapped her arms around her. Arya. She wanted to sleep, to dream a nice dream of Winterfell as it had been before, of her father and mother and Bran, Rukan, and Sansa, of her cousin Jon, mussing her hair, and of Robb and his wedding feast, when she had eaten so many berry tarts that her mouth was stained blue and she had been too excited to sleep. She would have liked that. She would have liked that better than anything. "Arya," her mother said again, "we've had a letter from Robb. Ben Stark has been found. Your uncle is alive." Arya would have smiled, but she saw quickly that her mother was not, that if anything her face darkened, and she looked sadder. "Truly?" she asked, carefully. "Truly?" He was beyond the wall, in a place called Hardham. Arya knew it. An old ruined place, accursed, old Nan had told her. "Your father was with him." Something in her tone made Arya want to pull away, to put her hands over her ears, no matter how much she told herself she must be brave. Without knowing why, she felt tears well in her eyes. But he died. Arya knew it, she knew. Nothing good would ever happen again, not after Bran had died, and even if it did, something more horrible would come after that. Her mother nodded, gravely. "Yes. He was alive all this time in Hardham, but when they tried to leave it, your father died. Lord Dustin found his body, and brought back ice with him to the wall." Ice. Her father's great sword, all reply Valyrian steel. She had almost forgotten about it. Whenever her father had condemned a man to death, he did the deed himself with his great sword. If you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look him in the face and hear his last words, she'd heard him tell Robb once. Only, the sword hadn't been any good when it mattered. Her own sword was hidden away in a chest beneath her bed. A wild thought came to her that if she was there, with needle in hand, she might have defended her father. But that made her sadder than anything. That sick feeling began to grow once more, like a hole, a hollow, sad place was forming inside her. Suddenly, she was sure that she would never feel happy again, that the hole inside her would stay the same and would never feel any better, even if she lived to be as old Nan. Her mother touched her cheek. "You can weep, child. There's no shame in that." She didn't want to. She wanted to be brave as a Wolverine, brave as Robb, brave as her father. But tears streamed down her face all the same, blinding her. It was a time before she slept, and when at last she drifted off, it was in her mother's arms, her head aching, hot tears wetting the pillow below her and the front of her mother's shift. Arya didn't dream the nice dream she wanted. Instead, she was a wolf, running free through the moonlit forest, baring her teeth in a low rumbling growl as she emerged from beneath the trees to where she smelled the rank stench of fear from her prey. When she woke, her mother already gone from her side, she could taste blood in her mouth. It was past midday, she could tell by the sounds outside of a castle well awake, but she stayed in bed, pulling the covers over her head. Last night, she had not had the heart to ask who killed her father, but she found her thoughts turning to it now. No one told her the first time, and doubtless no one would the second. Bran would have learned the truth, if he was still alive. Her little brother could perch for hours among the shapeless, rain-worn gargoyles that brooded over the first keep, watching all of the castle and everyone in it. It had taught him all of Winterfell's secrets. High above them all, he would tell her of how he could see the men drilling with wood and steel in the yard, the cooks tending their vegetables in the glass garden, restless dogs running back and forth in the kennels, the silence of the godswood, the girls gossiping beside the washing well. He had even heard Jon talk to Uncle Ben of joining the Night's Watch before he'd told the rest of them. He'd boasted to Arya, and seen Beth Castle comfort Jane Poole the morning of Robb's wedding. She knew only it had something to do with the monsters that everyone spoke of, from the kitchen maids to the stable boys. They would grow quiet whenever she came upon them, or turn their talk too quickly to other things, but she heard mention of Grumpkins and Snooks from some laughing mouths, and whispers of Whites from some that were quieter. Once, when she practiced her needlework with Septa Mordane, the voices of Hood and Wyl drifted in from where they stood outside. "The cold winds are rising," Hood was saying. Jory and Alan saw it with their own eyes. "It's the others, they've risen once more." Wyl snorted and would have said something, but Septa Mordane's face turned red and she went to the door, and told them they needed silence so they might focus on their sewing. "It is written in the 7-point star that spirits, Whites, and revenants cannot harm a pious man, so long as he is armored in his faith," Septa Mordane had murmured, when she'd sat down. "Remember that, child. In old Nan's stories, there were giants and mammoths and cannibals beyond the wall. and whites, with blue eyes and cold black hands, and wildlings who sold their children to the others. In her stories, White Walkers moved through the world and winters and nights would last for generations. The dead things swept over holdfasts and cities and kingdoms, felled heroes, and armies by the score, riding their pale dead horses and leading hosts of the slain. Rob would kill it. Even if it was some monster, or the fiercest wildling in Mance Rayder's army. Her father hadn't had a wolf like Rob did, nor did he have dragons. With dragons, you could do anything. You could fly across the world in half the time it took to travel by horse. You could see the world from high up like no one could, not even Bran. And you could burn away all your enemies, like Aegon the Conqueror did. And Daenerys had promised to protect Rob and Jon, Arya reminded herself. She'd asked her to before she left for the war, and the princess said she would. Having dragons had to make a difference, didn't it? When she thought of that, it made her feel better, only just enough to push off her covers, get out of bed, and step outside. It snowed for a fortnight afterwards, turning Winterfell into a white wilderness. Every day, the men pushed back the snow out of the pathways and the yards, but in the places where they shoveled it, the snow grew like an icy trench around her, first knee-high, then waist-high, then higher than her head. It was the heaviest fall of snow Arya had ever seen, though when she'd said that to Sir Roderick he'd smiled kindly, and told her some men would say this was only autumn's kiss. It reminded her of a summer's snow long ago when her and Bran had ambushed Arya with a dozen snowballs as she emerged from the keep. Bran had perched on the roof of the covered bridge, out of reach, but her sister had chased her through the stables and around the kitchen. Sansa might even have caught her, but she'd slipped on some ice. Arya came back to see if she was hurt, and when she said she wasn't, Arya hit her in the face with another snowball. Sansa grabbed her leg and pulled her down and was rubbing snow in her hair when Jory came along and pulled them apart, laughing. The memory made Arya smile, for the first time in weeks. She coaxed Rickon and Shaggydoke to join her outside then, promising an adventure, and even gone to the nursery to fetch the baby. Cregan was so bundled up that his hood kept falling over his eyes, and in the end Arya had to carry him. She brought Hodder along too, and they sat together in the snow, and Arya taught them how to make snowballs. Rickon put his mind to it with a rare focus, his tongue sticking out of his mouth as he tried to shape them, and once he'd mastered it, he took to overseeing Krej, ordering him to do it this way and that so it would not melt from the heat of his hands. Cregan paid him no mind. He was more interested in trying to eat the snow than in making snowballs, and would laugh every time the cold of it touched his face. When at last they had their cache of 20 snowballs, Arya wouldn't throw them at the babies. Instead, she gathered them in her cloak and they chased after their wolves in the Godswood, Cregan clinging to her, tossing snowball after snowball at Shaggydoke and Nymeria, who raced wildling through the trees, jumping high to dodge them or otherwise catching them in their mouths. After a while, some of the other children joined them, and the sound of their laughter rung out through Winterfell. They were breathless by the time their snowballs were gone, and Aunt Lyanna found them by the hot pools. Her aunt crossed her arms over her chest as though she would chide them, but there was an amused look to her face and Arya knew at once they would get no punishment. Come along was all she said, disappearing behind the trees. They followed, all the way to the kitchens, where Gage had a baked apple waiting for each of them. "Can I give one to the baby?" Arya asked. She had Krej in her lap. He liked so much to be held, but the moment he was tired of it he would fuss and push and whine until you set him on the ground. Now, he kept reaching up, trying to snatch pieces of apple from her. Only a little, her aunt conceded, he's not meant to have sweets. Let me feed the baby, Rickon said through a mouth already full of apple. No, Arya protested. He's happy sitting with me. No. Rickon shouted. I want the baby. You're too little, you'll drop him. No. I'm not little anymore. Aunt Lyanna laughed, and cut through their squabbling. Arya will hold him, but you may each feed him a little. He'll be glad of it, I'm sure. They were both dissatisfied with their compromise, but they obeyed all the same, cutting away small pieces of apple and taking turns to feed Krej, who chewed on it happily with the handful of teeth that he'd grown, dribbling down his chin. As the kitchen grew quiet, the ache in heart came back then. Aunt Lyanna seemed to sense it. She was looking at Arya with a look that reminded her not of her father, but Uncle Ben. It hurts, her aunt said, and though she spoke quietly, her voice was clear and grave. I know it hurts. No sweet words can take that away. It won't get any better, but you'll grow stronger and learn to bear it. Yes. I'll be stronger. She would. She had to. The Dornishmen arrived to Winterfell a week later, when the storm cleared for them to complete the remaining part of their march from White Harbor. This time, Arya would not hide in her room. Her mother called her to the solar the day before, and sat her before the table with Maester Luwin and Sir Roderick. They had her sit before them, as though she were one of the Lord's bannermen, and she looked out across the table, with its endless papers and scrolls and one large map of the north, spread across the length of it. Doran Martell's armies are arriving tomorrow, and there are things that are too dangerous for you not to know, her mother had said, gravely, and told her of things she'd only heard in whispers, of the rumors that followed the Prince of Dragonstone from the south, that he had broken his promise to Lady Margaery Tyrell and would not wed her. The prince said that it was because Lord Tyrell had starved King's Landing, closing the Rosa Road and keeping his harvests to his own people, but that didn't make much sense to Arya, since Lord Tyrell said he'd closed the Rosa Road because the prince wouldn't marry Lady Margaery. What mattered was that some people said that he had done something to Daenerys, though none knew what. Arya chewed her lip. She hadn't minded the prince. He had saved her on Dragonstone. Her mother had only made her tell the tale once. It frightened Arya for so long, to think of the heat and the smoke, of burning alive in her room, until she realized it was then that the dragons were born, though she hadn't gotten to see it. Afterwards, when they had to go on the ships to escape, he'd wrapped his own cloak around her though his hands were shaking. She saw him again in Riverrun, and he was friendly and smiling, not morose and quiet like the king. If the prince hurt Daenerys, Robb would have to duel him, wouldn't he? Arya had asked. Sir Roderick tugged at his whiskers then, and Maester Luwin frowned, but her mother only went on patiently. No, sweeterling. It's not so simple as that. Aegon is a prince, and he commands a dragon. Sometimes turning away from a fight can be bravery, not cowardice, especially when losing would risk many innocent lives. Robb chose the right path. He spoke to Daenerys, and he says we're to greet the Dornishmen as allies, her mother said. Their armies are led by Oberyn Martell. Do you know that name? Do you remember your lessons? Maester Luwin asked. Arya had memorized more houses and their sigils than Bran had. He's the king's master of whisperers. Prince Doran is his elder brother and his sister is Queen Elia. That makes him brother by law to the king, too. Her mother nodded, and uncle to Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaenys. They call him the Red Viper. Do you remember why? He fought a duel with the Lord of Euronwood with a poisoned blade and the Lord died. All of her brothers and sisters had liked that story. It seemed like something out of one of Sansa's stupid books. Or so some say, her mother clarified. Prince Doran sent him to exile for that, and sent his own son to squire for the dead Lord Euronwood's son. These tales teach us that he is a dangerous man. They teach us that we have to be careful in what we do, and what we say while he's here. He might ask you questions and try to learn things from you, or speak boldly and see how you might react. You can't evade every question, but take time to think before you respond and try to speak as little of Robb as you can. Her mother reached across the table, and took her hand. Your Aunt Lyanna. You are old enough to understand what it means for her to have had a bastard by the king while he was wed to Queen Elia, are you not? Yes, Arya lied. He dishonored her. Her mother saw through her. He dishonored Lyanna, or Elia. Arya tried to think, but it made her suddenly shy, just like the morning after Robb's wedding when the sheets from the bedding had been brought out before the hall, and she saw drops of blood staining it. She was old enough to know how babies are made, what people meant when they said a man and woman lay together, and how that was something that must only be for husbands and wives. But it made her feel strange to think of her aunt doing that with the king. She reddened, and mother squeezed her hand. Some might say that the king dishonored both. The Martells would surely say he did so to Queen Elia, her mother said. I don't say this to frighten you, only so you might better understand. You're not a girl anymore, Arya. And there's bad blood between the Starks and Martells that goes back long before your birth. Promise you'll be careful. She had promised. That night, it was as though her mother's words had willed something into being. Arya slept, without dreams for once. Nymeria woke her, licking her face, when the world was still quiet and dark outside, and Arya found she felt sick and achy with something sticky on her thighs. Blood, she knew somehow, before she threw back the furs and looked. She stared at the bedclothes for a long moment, and the dark red stain that would have surely soaked into the feather bed. Slowly, without thinking, she rose and pulled a robe over her body and in the darkness, and went out into the silent halls with her wolf. Her mother wasn't asleep when Arya went into her room, but weeping, muffling the sounds of her sobs in her pillow. "Mother!" She looked up, startled. "Arya! What's the matter? What's happened?" I'm bleeding." Mother rose quickly then, rushing across the room to her, but realization seemed to dawn on her as she took the final steps towards Arya. Gently, without words, she helped Arya clean herself and bind wrappings to catch the blood, and gave her a shift from her own chests that smelled faintly of lavender. Arya crawled into bed beside her mother, and stared at the ceiling. It was a while before either of them spoke. "You're a woman now," Mother said quietly, at last. She knew what that meant, in all the ways that mattered. Robb and her mother would pick some husband for her, and even if she didn't like him, she would have to stand in the Godswood and marry him. Afterwards, his brothers and cousins would strip off her clothes and carry her into his bed, and he would do whatever he wanted to her, until her belly grew large with his child. If it wasn't a son, they would have to do it again and again until it was. The thought of it twisted her stomach more than it already was, and she would have said as much if Mother hadn't just been crying. Instead, Arya nestled into her arm, like she was a girl, not a woman. Prince Oberyn was everything Arya imagined he would be. He rode before his brother's armies on a horse unlike any she had ever seen before, a black stallion with a mane and tail the color of fire, and when he dismounted and handed the reins to his squire, she could see he was a tall and slender man, with thin eyebrows, and striking eyes and hair as black as his horse's, streaked with silver and receding in a widow's peak. Dawn was all deserts and sun, Arya knew, but the cold seemed to bother him little. He smiled as he came forward and greeted her mother and Arya and Rickon after her, and even lifted Craig into his arms as though he were a doll and declared him a bonny baby. Cregan seemed to enjoy the attention. He laughed wildly each time the red viper tossed him in the air, and when at last he was set down, his cheeks were a pretty red. Something in Prince Oberyn's sharp eyes narrowed when he saw Lyanna Stark. Arya had been surprised when her aunt had come to greet their guests with them, dressed in a grey gown, her brown hair brushed until it shone, that made her look like half a princess herself. The red viper took her hand in his and kissed it courteously, and afterwards when his nephew was introduced, a short-legged and stocky man who looked little like his uncle, Prince Quentyn did the same. Arya had heard it said that Dornishmen were small and swarthy, with black hair and small black eyes, but the soldiers were all sorts. And there was something to their accents that she liked. They spoke quickly, stringing words together so it sounded like half a song. Arya would have left the table and gone to speak to them if her mother had not warned her to behave, and instead she contented herself with hearing the pieces of their talk from the high table as they feasted. Her attention was drawn back when she heard mention of Sansa, as the Red Viper told her mother he was glad to hear Harry on Karstark had been found. Arya had been glad too, in a way. She'd thought Harry on good-natured, though Sansa had complained about him to no end, from his beard to his nails down to the boots he wore and laces he chose for them. She liked the Great Jon too and Lord Dustin, but she couldn't understand why the gods had spared them, and not her father. "And what of your youngest daughter, my lady? Have you made a match for her?" the Red Viper was asking. Somewhere under the table, Lyanna found her hand and held it tight. Her aunt showed no other signs that something was amiss. She was looking out at the hall as before, a faint smile on her lips, serene and ladylike. It made Arya nervous. "No, my lord," Mother said. "My lord husband thought her too young. We had only celebrated Sansa's marriage before the war began." The Red Viper was quiet for a moment, and though Arya did not dare look, she heard the clatter of knife and fork as he ate something off his plate. It felt like an eternity before he spoke again. "My brother has 2 sons, as you might know. Quentyn is older than your eldest son and betrothed, but Prince Tristan is nearly of age with your Arya. He's a good lad, and gone to King's Landing to be my sister's side and ease her longing for her children and husband. The Queen seems to think they would make a good match." "We are honored, my lord," Mother said. "But I am no longer Lady of Winterfell. I hold the seat in my son's name, but it is Robb's right as lord to make a match for his sister." I'm afraid I cannot speak for him in this. To Arya's horror, the Red Viper leaned across the table to look at her, past her mother. I'm told it's every young girl's dream to be a princess, is that so? Nymeria and Shaggydogs had been locked outside in the yard, and Arya wished she was here now. If she was, she would. She would. She couldn't think, not with Prince Oberyn looking at her. No, she burst out, despite herself, and tried to make it better afterwards, my lord. For a moment, the table was so quiet that Arya felt her face redden despite herself, but then the Red Viper was laughing, as though she had said the most amusing thing in the world. My daughters would say the same, surely, he said, and lifted up wine cup. A toast then, to Lord Robb. And his right. And to the hope he will look kindly on our offer. To Robb, Lord of Winterfell. The men in the hall lifted their cups and flagons and carried his toast, and added their own, to the prince, to the king, to Sunspear, before breaking out into bawdy songs that had never been heard in Winterfell before. Beneath the table, Aunt Lyanna's nails dug into Arya's hand painfully, as though to root her in place. Chapter 51, Jon 9. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. It had not been long since Jon had seen the sea, but it seemed an altogether different thing here, at the edge of Westeros itself, looking at the wild, grey waters that remained of the enemy Daenerys had vanquished. It was a choppy, wild, winter sea, but even here there was life. They stood against the brutal wind and watched the massive, dark fins of whales rise and fall against the waves. Further down the rocky bay, hundreds of seals had made their own little kingdom. Some were basking on the rocks, others swimming in the water, and everywhere, the dragons made quick work of them, spitting out their flames and eating them as they writhed in the fire and screamed out their pain. Jon had not grown used to the sight of dragons at their hunt, greedy and gluttonous, but it did not hold any interest for Aegon and Daenerys. It was the horizon they looked to, and then, behind, over their shoulders to where the storm stubbornly remained in the sky, its borders spreading like spilled ink. It is as you said, the king said. Daenerys did not smile at that, nor seem to take any joy from the vindication that the tale she had told them was true. I was the one that doubted her, Jon remembered. Aegon had not needed any proof. You should make a name for the new sea, as explorers always do. These are the new borders of your kingdom, Daenerys said, softly. Aegon snorted. It was an ugly sound. And what a kingdom it is. Soon the dead will outnumber the living. By rights this should have all gone to Rhaenys. She would have set it right. That was something Jon had not heard before. When did you become cruel? Daenerys frowned. Would you rather it was your sister that stood here, and you who were safe in the south? No. But if it were Rhaenys, we would not be here at all. She would have found a better way, as she always does. Aegon kicked at a rock. Besides, nowhere is safe anymore. What it took for his brother to say that, he could not say. The thought was an uncomfortable one, but not altogether hard to think. Even as a child, she had always done her duty without complaint and with a smile. He had not seen her wed Edmure Tully, but he had seen enough in Riverrun to know that man had been charmed with her, as so many others were. And she was kind, kinder than him and Aegon both, and that seemed an important thing for a queen. For the first time he wondered if the news of their father's death had reached her, and how, and on whose tongue. Rhaenys is not here, Daenerys said, not unkindly. There's no use looking back and thinking on what might have been. We must look forward. You both have the strength and I have the knowledge, and together we have dragons, Aegon offered. Daenerys nodded. Dragons. And the blood. We share that too. It was her way of drawing them together, of forcing them to speak, but neither of them had the heart for it. Aegon had remained stubbornly silent, and Jon found he had no words for his brother. His brother would have him grovel, no doubt, and beg for forgiveness, but he could not bring himself to, here of all places, when all that had passed between them seemed to matter so little. For me, perhaps, but not to a king. Despite what he said now, in this cold and miserable place, Jon knew Aegon would not abdicate to their sister, though he could do so with a word. It was well known that of his children, King Rhaegar had favoured his daughter the most, but nor was it a secret that Aegon's conception was under the light of the red comet, which the king took for a blessing, with the secret of the prophecy shared only with a few. Jon looked back, despite Daenerys' warning. The storm was ugly, and growing worse each day. They had seen neither other nor white on their journey as they skirted around its edges, following first the path Daenerys had made to see if it was there that their enemy had taken form again, but neither had they seen corpses in the snow, as they had around the wall. It troubled him, and the thought had begun to grow in his mind that they were there, gathering under that black sky, somehow waiting for them. His companions were in no rush to face it. Aegon knelt by the sea, washing the mud off his boots, and Daenerys sat, watching the waves. Jon sat beside her, for want of anything else to do, and watched the water turn red with the blood of the dragon's prey. The night before they came upon the bodies, they all sensed something. Perhaps it was the cold winds rising once more of the storm filling up the sky before them, or the disquiet of the dragons, who remained on the ground and bit and snarled at each other. Or simply the growing fear, that soon they would come to what they would come to, and see what they would see, and once they did, it would be far past the hope of returning home. For Daenerys, that place was lost already, for that was what the vision they had seen in Aegon's candle meant, did it not? For her, it was that place that Jon had not even dared dream of, that island of sorcery and salt and smoke where his siblings and his aunt had been born, which passed from heir to heir. Its very thought was like treason. Jon could not recall so much as daring to say the word, but it remained unsaid now, as did everything else they had seen, all they had dreamed of, Winterfell and the Red Keep, and everything that was south of the wall and lost to them forever. And the wall itself. That was what he should have seen by the queer light of the candle, not Winterfell. That was what should live in his thoughts now and forever, the only home he would ever know, such as it was. He had seen it break and yet he had not forced his will against his dragon and turned around. What was the use? He had to go north, or else it would not matter whether the wall stood, whether Winterfell did. It would be swept away, every inch of it. There was no doubt now, though. The others felt it too. Aegon drew Daenerys away one evening and stood with her beneath the snow-covered branches of an oak, and told her things that the wind did not drift to Jon's ears. Jon looked away when his brother began to speak, and looked back to see Daenerys, silent and still, the snowflakes mingling with her breath and her hair. They walked back to the dragons, and to Jon, together then, though the king looked at his feet as he did, and did not speak when Daenerys began to tell them of all they might expect. Horror was the word for it, as it had been for so much of late. Creatures pulled from old Nan's stories, which the princess shuddered as she spoke of in hushed tones, as though the very mention would be their summoning, and with them strange visions, not to be trusted. It was her hunger perhaps, that had brought them on, and her weakness too, but she could not know for certain, and told them to guard their minds against it all the same. And so Jon had tried, he had tried, and it was thoughts of his brother that kept creeping towards him, the brother who would not speak to him, would not look at him, even now, when they readied themselves to meet death. At times he seemed on the brink of saying something, or perhaps that was only Jon. They would be sitting beside the fire they built each night and Aegon would hold himself so still, as though readying himself for something, but then he would seem to think better of it and turn to Daenerys, as easy and quick as anything, and ask how she had slept, or if she was hungry, or how long she thought it might be until they reached their destination. Daenerys would look between them, hearing the unsaid, never amused and always concerned, and take a moment before answering Aegon's question, as though in that moment there was hope for reconciliation. If there was, it would not come like that. Besides, what was the use of thinking of it now? They were past the point of denial. The first few nights the cold was like any other, the cold of winter long delayed, but it turned, slowly and then all at once, into fingers that found their way under their clothes to take hold of their skin, and winds that whipped so hard that the dragons would not take flight, and a darkness that was more than darkness, and shut the sky off to them. But when they saw the enemy they chased at last, it was it that came to them. That night it was Aegon who kept watch, and woke them not with a word but a whistle. They had risen quickly then, scrambling, and met him at the edge of a frozen brook that curved through the trees. There was no wind, Jon realized suddenly, no leaves sighing in the wind. Only the cold, still as a crypt, cradling in its heart what seemed at first glance to be others. He had Longclaw in his hand before he could think, and was pulling Daenerys behind him, but she pushed past him. When he went after her, he could see they lay in the ground like corpses, or else sat with their back against the trees like living men, though whatever dark hand had made them did not give them life. They were as dolls carved from crystal, unmoving, and when he looked upon their faces, he tasted horror. John knew them. They were the faces of the men who were his sworn brothers, and who he had called friends, Sam Tarly and Dolorous Ed and Gren, made of ice. In some places, whatever it was that formed the bonds that gave them shape failed. PYP was missing a piece of his skull, as thin and fragile as an eggshell, and when John looked within it, he saw nothing, only a husk, like a snake that had shed its skin. Others made his eyes water to look at, and it not merely because of the wind. 5 wolves were in the snow, laid out as though to make a path for him that led to those to whom they belonged, to each of his cousins, translucent and dead, shimmering faint blue like ghosts. It is a lie. Just as what they'd seen in the candlelight, a trick, some weapon of the enemy meant to make them lose heart and hope. In Arya's hands, he saw her clutching the sword he had made for her, and thought there could be nothing worse than that. But there was, drawn out before them like torment. He saw his uncle Eddard, lying on his back in the snow, his uncle Benjen beside him and his mother after and Rhaenys after that, and at the end of them all his father, not as he was in life but in death, body crushed, face caved in, marked by the 1,000 injuries which had killed him. Behind him, there was the sound of crunching and glass breaking, as Aegon picked his way through his own graveyard, smashing beneath his boots whatever faces he found in the snow. Daenerys was more gentle with her dead. John saw a glimpse of another Robb, her Robb, not the bearded man that he saw in the snow who had walked the wall with him and spoken of war, but Robb as he was the day he was wed, clean-shaven and finely dressed and so young. In his arms, he held himself in miniature, only, not. There was something different to the child's face, and when Daenerys stepped forward and held it gently in her hands, and then, less gently, crushed it in her hands, John knew who he was looking at. "It's not real," he said, to himself, and to her. "You said there would be tricks. This is one. I know." Her back was to him as she spoke, and when she rose, she did not turn, but looked intently at the trees. "There is a hill before us." John looked. It was steep and thickly wooded and blanketed in snow, white and pristine and unbroken. "And behind us and to our left and our right," Aegon said. A week ago, he had crouched before the frozen face of a steam and used his dagger to take off his hair, cutting it off down to the scalp so it would not bother him when he flew. He took down his scarf now, and ran his fingers across his head. "Is the one ahead any different?" "Yes," Daenerys said, without turning. "I have been here before." Aegon hurried to her side then, and drew the blade that was Dark Sister from its scabbard. It was then that John dared to look at his brothers dead. But they were smashed, all of them, crushed into 1,000 tiny crystals, already lost within the snow. They followed Daenerys, as they had so often of late. She had not claimed the command, but it had become hers all the same as Aegon ceded his once they were past the point where they had journeyed together, and Aegon had turned back alone. John did not know what had happened there, and did not ask. It does not matter. So little seemed to, when they were north of the wall, and the world was so empty of things with warm blood in their veins, which thought with the mind of man and beast, and were driven forward by such wants and hurts, and not the empty hunger of the enemy. If the wall was the end of the world, each day brought them further away from it and into something unknown, and terrible. He had thought these lands cruel when he travelled with his sworn brothers, and later the half-hand, and after that the free folk. Death had been close then, and hunger and danger and cold, but he had not even made it further north than the fist. Aegon had gone further, only just, and Daenerys further than them all, to the place where the sea began once more. The wall had been at their backs then, and the knowing that it stood there, ragged and poorly manned as it was a kind of hope, if only the hope of retreat. But now he did not know, he did not know. His last sight of it was of great sheets of ice falling to the ground and leaving naked the stone below, the black blocks that had not been touched by air since the wall was built, but his dragon had been chasing after Daenerys so quickly, and it had turned into a white blur, the wind rushing up to blind him as he twisted his neck to look. Winterfell remains. It endured, if nothing else did. They climbed, listening for every sound, every movement as they did, even though they knew that was the least of their troubles. A branch shifting or snow settling under boots might mean a white, but the others made no sounds. They came only with the cold, and just about now John found it hard to know if this was winter's chill, or something more. The snowdrifts reached their calves at first, and then their thighs, and still they pushed on, until they came almost to the top of Daenerys' head, and Jon could no longer hold his tongue. The wind filled the air with fine white powder that shone like glass around them. Not long ago there had been days so dark and miserable that they could not see the sun, nor any light at all save for torchlight. But though the sky above their heads was black, to the south and east it was day yet, and it was that light that worked its way towards them and guided them now. There, look. There's an entrance there, through that cleft. You've been here before? Jon asked. Yes. It used to be a weirwood grove, but Shadowtamer burned it all. There's tunnels beneath and an opening some leagues to the north, where I fell through. Some magic was on this place and it was not the magic of the others. I met a man, or a beast, and he told me how I would find them. Aegon frowned. What does it matter? He did not mean it cruelly, but it was not sweet to hear all the same. The words had been on his brother's tongue too often, asking what this mean or how that fit, as though it were a tale they were in, with each part crafted by the storyteller and leading to some pleasant, or at least, expected end. Daenerys had no answer for him. And so, Jon gave one. Come, we can speak of this when we are away from this place. They walked back silently, the way they had come, Aegon looking over his shoulder this way and that as though the enemy would spring out to face them then and there. And perhaps they will. Disquiet had begun to fill Jon's heart, too. Fear could be useful, though, he'd learn it, and so when he heard the sound, almost imperceptible, of wings flapping, he notched his bow without thinking, and brought it down quick as a word. Aegon got a second, and a third, and Jon the one and two after, until they took down a dozen between them, 12 creatures that had been ravens once, before they had died and been made to rise once more. Aegon lifted one out of the snow to take his arrow back, and the creature had squawked and shuddered and twisted to peck at him all the time, and when he at last pulled away the shaft, it took half the bird's middle with it. The injury did nothing to slow it. It flew clumsily through the air, almost like a rock when thrown, over their heads and into the cave Daenerys had shown them. There was no use to words then. They knew what was behind them, and so they moved as quickly as the snow let them, the ground cracking beneath their boots until above them it was not ravens that flew, but the dragons at their useless hunt, searching for prey that was long dead, whether hunted by men when men still walked these lands, or frozen and starved, and risen from the dead for some foul purpose. He did not think any sane man could stand in the shadow of the dragons and not flinch away. Even with his own dragon, there were times when he would hold his breath and know not whether it was going to fall upon him. Jon felt no such fear now, only a relief that made him feel a coward. They walked until their feet were beyond aching, until the cold that was then numbness swept in and he wondered which of his toes would be blue when he next removed his boots, or if the wool socks and the leather and the skin would simply freeze to one another. He did not check, even when they were back atop the hill upon which they had made their camp, and he was in the snow with his brother, building a fire. Daenerys watched them, a queer look to her face, and when they were done, she stepped close to the warmth and met his eyes across the flame. When you sleep, what is it you dream of? He found himself thinking of Thorin half-hand, as he had so often since he went beyond the wall once more. Thorin had asked about his wolf dreams, too. Last night I dreamt of nothing. You do not dream of Bran? Jon was startled. Bran Stark? No. I don't dream of him. Why? I do, Daenerys said, persistent. I dreamt of him when Aegon and I left Dragonstone. He was telling me not to be frightened. I dreamt of him after too, and when I was in the cave, that creature spoke to me of a Brandon. And now we are here again. He frowned, and my dreams. I flew your dragon but once, and when I did his eyes were red. I dreamt of that too, but when I looked into Brightson's eyes, it was Bran I saw. She bit her lips, chapped and sore. I thought now that you've claimed her, you might too. A lie was quick on his lips, but he bit it back. That was something a boy might do, grasp for something, anything to say to keep away the truth, but those days were long past. And he had spoken of this before. To Robb, he remembered, in one endless, desperate night, where the words had come slow and awkward. He found himself trying not to look at his brother, even now, and that left him angry, though not for any reason he could name. What does it matter? Aegon was right, on that account. What did the fears of his brother matter? What did his own fear of what he was, when it was the end of the world they stood before? I don't know all that happened to Bran beyond the wall. But my father questioned him for hours the night he returned, and after he died, it was Bran that helped me to mount the dragon," Jon said, carefully. "He changed his skin. It might sound queer to you, but it saved us all when Night Fort fell. We weren't sure if the dragon would let me near her at all, or burn us all." There was shame in every word, but Daenerys' face was unchanged, and when Aegon spoke, his voice was flat and quiet. "There's magic about that boy," the king said to Daenerys, not to Jon. "The glass candle finds him each time. But where does that leave us? Bran Stark is not here. What we have before us is a cave at the center of a storm, and before it the figures of those we loved were laid out like some calling beacon." "Or a warning," Jon said. The fire did little to warm him, for the cold that was rising up around them could not be so easily vanquished. When he glanced at the path they had made in the snow, he could see the mist stretching out its fingers to claim it. He went on. "We set out to find the enemy, and we found them. Not what is left is to face them." They spent the rest of the morning speaking of what would come next, and eating another of their meager meals for which none had any appetite. He could not count how many hours he had passed thus, in anticipation of a fight to come, wondering if his father had ever felt this way, or his uncle Eddard, or Robb. Or Aegon. His brother had fought his own battles too. And he fought another that day, before him, though not with a sword. Aegon and Daenerys sat sparring with their words, Aegon insistent that Daenerys stay behind, Daenerys insisting that they must remain together, or else perish. Jon half listened, until he could bear it no longer. "You cannot come with us. You don't know how to wield a weapon. If we are to root out our enemy, we need to move quickly and with skill," Jon said, caring little if his words were blunt, for the day was as warm as it would ever be, and past time for them to hunt their enemy. "You should stay with the dragons," Aegon added, hurriedly. Jon continued, "Take them to the sky and burn any enemy you see so we aren't ambushed." He rose at last then, and was surprised by the ache in his legs. "You can help us there. But you will do us no good inside the caves." If his words wounded her, he did not look, and told himself he did not care. He took his pack and his sword and walked to his death, and the world's, and thought only of what Daenerys had told them, of the tunnels and the caves and the openings in the walls that led to drops, or to even more rooms that spread out like a maze before them, but most of all to the undead thing she had seen at the center of it, who had become one with the tree. Jon did not know if that was their enemy, or if, when they found him, and killed him, it would bring an end to all this. It seemed too easy, and nothing had been easy of late. He knew only that there was something that must die in those caves, even if he died with it, and to turn away from it would make him a coward before all he loved. Maybe it would mean nothing in the end, but that was the way of war, was it not? Soldiers often marched without hope. Mance Rayder's army had done the same, and his uncles as well when they fled Hardham, as had Jon when he went in search of those sheltered there. It made it no easier. The men trudged forward in a silence, and if Aegon's heart harbored such dark thoughts, the scarf he wrapped around his face hid it well. No doubt he does, he decided, for what was Jon turning his back to? A life on the wall, alone but for his duty, hated by half his brothers who thought him turncloak for sheltering the free folk, hated perhaps by the Lord of Winterfell once Robb learned of his promise to Tormund, from now until the end of my days. To the south, Aegon walked away from a kingdom at war, no doubt, and more war to come, but a crown all the same, one that he had spent his life waiting for. He would have married, if not Margaery Tyrell then some other fair maid waiting to take her place, and lived to see his sons and daughters born and grown. The taste of that was more sour, no doubt. Their march was endless, and too quick. When they came upon the gap in the rock it seemed as though it came up before them all at once. Aegon raised his hand to still Jon, stopped as though to listen for something in the wind, and heard it and was content. Dragons, Jon knew at once. That awareness had come to him slowly, that sense that they were near and the certainty that if he looked up, they would be there, flying in the black sky. Aegon did not look up, but he seemed no less sure, and quickly, before Jon could so much as speak, he climbed down into the abyss that awaited them. The fear that gripped Jon then was thick enough to choke him. He was clambering down when he heard his brother call his name, and once he was within the cave, he felt as though he had stepped into the heart of winter itself. It was cold enough to kill here, and not for the creatures that shrouded themselves in the cold, but the air itself that was so still, so frigid that no living thing could thrive in it. And light. It was not fire that lit the path here but a harsh blue light that hurt to look at too closely, like staring at the sun overlong. It took John more than a moment to gather himself, as he reached to pull Longclaw from its sheath. It was no light, he realized, but the reflection of it on the walls around him that Daenerys had described as earth, but were now covered in ice, slick as anything. Before him the room narrowed, and led to a single opening, and 100 rooms beyond it. He would have called for Aegon then, had it not been so quiet, so still. Aegon is not here, he thought, uncertain. He would have waited for him, despite whatever anger sat still heavy between them. On the ground below him was frost, and below that dirt, but the only footsteps that marked it were his own. This is a crypt, he thought. Death was here. He knew its presence, in the way ghost could sense that of prey leagues away, but he did not know its shape, yet, nor the one who would bring it. There was hope of turning back still, but no use. To retreat now would be to flee south, take whoever still lived to Winterfell and make a stand there. But Winterfell too would fall. It was painful to think of it. Half of the north was gone, if the unanswered ravens to the lords were any measure, and the dead would sweep them all away, dragons or not, if they made no end to it here. Jon took a step forward and a deep rumble followed, not from somewhere deep inside the caves but from above him, sending pieces of dirt raining and bringing with it a warmth familiar, that melted away at the ice on the walls around them, turning the slick surface into a wet sheen. Somewhere above him, Daenerys had let loose her dragon's flame. The grid had once spun the tale for him of Gendal's folk, who had entered the caves below the wall and went deep and deeper, until every turn back led to stone rather than sky, and their torches fell, one by one. She had said that on a still night you could hear the children's children sobbing under the hills, still looking for the way back up. But Jon would not weep, no matter what faced him. He took a step forward, and another, until he was at the opening of the room, and stepping forward onto a bridge that cut through the dark. Daenerys' dragons had filled the world with sound once more, of roaring and the unfurling and tremendous flapping of wings, but it was far off, as faint as a whisper. Here, below, there was nothing but the silence. He met, and killed, the first other at the far end of the bridge. It was not like the graceful, almost beautiful creatures he had seen on the long march from Hardham, but a thing almost pitiful, half-formed and clumsy, like the dream of a beast, and not the beast itself. It died at the edge of his sword, and melted to his feet. Jon went on faster after that. In some rooms they had formed their dens, glittering structures of ice that seemed to stretch out endlessly on into cavern after cavern. Some of the shapes were clear, there were things here which stood as though in mockery of man, weeds sprouting from the ground like the smallest of crystals, in other places weapons of glass were notched against the wall, bows and swords and spears, but misshapen, like the other he had killed, half-formed and warped. But not all, he knew. The cold waxed and waned as he moved, from deadly to deadlier to the common frost of winter, and it was then he saw the vents that the dragons had wrought. Here and there in the roof, their fire had burned through earth and root, and the hot steam of their flame melted corners of the world within. Jon followed the straightest path, thinking of all Daenerys had told them, knowing that the others were drawn to heat but hoping it was to the dragons that they now worked to find, high up in the air, untouchable and deadlier than any sword he might wield. No one came to him, neither monster or man, as he stepped carefully over the roots, growing everywhere here, twisting through earth and stone, closing off some passages and holding up the roofs of others. It was there that all the color left the world. The world was black soil and charred wood and white frost, and when he stepped through a final cavern, he saw him, a man in white finery sitting in a tangled nest of roots, cradled on a woven weirwood throne. Jon would have thought him a corpse had it not been for his skin, thin as parchment and made of ice. The roots had grown over him, under him, and through him, and when he moved, all seemed to move with him. The roots that coiled around his legs burrowed around his thigh, another emerged from his shoulder, rounding about his broken body until they helped him to stand, as a man might lean on a cane. He has only one eye, Jon thought dimly, as he brought his sword up to strike him down. It was blue, terrible blue, and when Longclaw fell upon him, the creature did not die as another dies, but as a man. Almost. He fell to the ground, the roots flinching away from him, and writhed and shuddered on the ground, shaking off whatever magic remained to him. For a moment, Jon saw his father's face in that corpse, but only for a moment, and then it was as any other, that of a dead man, and then something altogether more grotesque, half melted water, half broken flesh. But dead. There was no great shifting in the world then, no release of breath that might have meant that an old power was vanquished, that the force which had drawn them here was undone. There was silence, for a moment, and then the great rush of footsteps from the far opening of the cavern and a voice familiar and frightened. John. It was Egon, not the phantom of the voice that he had heard before, but for true. His brother ran to him, hair pasted to his forehead with sweat, his sword in one hand, a wound bleeding from his shoulder. Run. Behind him came the wave of the dead that John had knew lurked here, but had hoped they were drawn above ground, where dragon flame might burn them. We should stay and make a stand, he said, almost as though hearing his thought. Another laughed. The sound was cruel, and cold as ice, and his brother was bleeding. They ran, finding the path that John had walked. He thought dimly of the danger that followed them, and then of Ygritte, the thoughts coming to him as quickly as his steps, pulling Egon with him, urging him on each time he hesitated before an opening to a chasm, unsure of where to step, or stumbled over a hidden route. He felt both heat and cold, arising together in the wind that poured down upon them. Ghost would come to him, if he could. Would the dragon he had claimed sense his danger too? But if she did, what might she do for him here, deep below ground? Better to flee now, go to the wall and burn everything down as she did, find some other rider and go to Winterfell, where they might make a stand, however hopeless, however doomed. Daenerys would know to do that, wouldn't she? No. The answer came to him as they ran across the threshold to the room from which they had entered. She would stay, and wait from them to emerge, and hope against hope that they would return until all was lost. The others were at their heels when he pulled his brother before him, to push him up and through the opening from which they descended. Even then, Egon was stubborn, struggling against his grip, whipping his head around to protest. His words did not reach John. He could hear nothing, feel nothing, save for the icy blade that took him beneath his ribs. Notes. I'm quite ashamed by how long it took me to get this chapter up, though I had the large majority of it written almost a week within posting the last chapter. I think I'm just growing more anxious as the story reaches its conclusion, and wanting to do it justice and not disappointing the readers. I'm really sorry for the delay, and I do hope this update provides you just a bit of enjoyment, or entertainment, or distraction today. I won't say much about this chapter, only that it is meant to mirror both Bran and Dany's own journey into the cave, and that the next chapters will answer many of the questions, and worries, and maybe even anger, that this chapter raises. Chapter 52, Robb X. Chapter text. Robb Stark's children lay sleeping in the nursery, his son having almost outgrown his crib, his daughter so small it seemed as though she swam in the blankets. Somewhere in Winterfell delicate clothing was found for her, befitting her noble blood. The half-formed thought came to him that nightgown she wore might have been Sansa's once, or Arya's. But he could not remember what they looked like when they were small, though he had held them, and played with them, and loved them. When he thought of Arya now, it was the young woman she had become, hiding her fear behind anger. And Sansa. The thought of her was too hard to bear. No ravens had returned from Carhold, and Harry on Karstark at last had left Winterfell, taking 5 of his kinsmen and riding for his lands. There was little Robb could turn his thoughts away from of late, and bury beneath useless hopes, but he did not let his mind linger long on what Harry on might find there. But hope was stubborn, even now. It crept back when the dead died a second time, and fell in the snow before them. They lay there still, buried now under the snow, though this morning Robb and 50 others had finished burning the first of the pyres and begun the hard, long work of digging them out. Hope crept again, when Jory let out the call that there were 2 riders on the horizon, and every heart in Winterfell leapt, thinking it was someone they had loved or lost, somehow returned to them. Robb was in the great hall when Jory found him and, with worry writ clear on his face, said there was a matter that needed his attention in the solar. They left the hall with every eye on them, and Robb heard the tale as they walked, of the wildlings that had come to the gates claiming they had ridden from the wall on the Lord Commander's word, and with the princess child in their care. He had not believed it, not for true, and when he stood before the wilderling girl, not much older than Sansa, and her homely husband, it was the ruddy-faced babe he saw first, brown-eyed and brown-haired. He might have cursed them then for thinking he could be so easily fooled, But the blanket fell away from the bundle in the man's arms, and all doubt fell away with it. Rob's child was smaller than the other, and awake and blinking at the ceiling with eyes that for a moment seemed dark blue, and another purple, and hair crowned with tufts of pale silver gold hair. "Give him to me." The man hesitated, and the anger rose so quickly in Rob that he knew if Grey Wind was still at his side, his wolf would have torn the wilderling's throat out. Instead, Jory had stepped forward, his hand on the hilt on his sword. But the wildlings had weapons too, Rob noticed quickly. The man carried a sword on his hip, and the girl a long knife, and though there were hundreds of armed Northmen outside the door, he did not doubt the wildlings to be ruthless and rash. The girl was the one who spoke then. "Jon. He made us promises. If she was frightened, she hid it well. Lord Stark will give you shelter and peace," he said, "if you bring his daughter to Winterfell. I fed her myself, and RYK built her a fire each night." Daughter. Jon had sent wildlings south, and broken the vows they had made. Each of the chiefs swear not to leave the wall and venture into northern lands, but it had brought his daughter to him. 1,000 questions came to his mind. The only one he feared to ask was where Daenerys was, that she would send their own child away thus. "Instead," he said, "and here you stand, within Winterfell's walls. And yet how I can know what you say is true? Perhaps you stole my child, thinking it would buy you safe passage in Winterfell to hide from winter." The past year had taught him much and more of wildlings, and he'd had a raven from Jon, sent as soon as the storm set by others lifted, but it said nothing of this, nor of Daenerys. Most of all, he watched them, to see what might pass unsaid between them. Anger flashed in the eyes of the girl, and confusion in that of the man that might have been her husband, which curdled quickly into suspicion. The man spat at the ground, but when Rob's daughter fussed in his arms, he pulled her close and quieted her with a touch. "Give her to me," Rob said again. Quickly and quietly, Jory walked to the door and opened it an inch, motioning to someone with his hands. Less than a moment later, Fat Tom and Desmond entered, armed and grim-faced. The wildlings did not yield. "You can't turn us out now, you can't," the girl said, and sounded her age at last. "Your king gave his word too. That matters to you lot, don't it? They made vows to my father." "And who is your father?" "Tormund Giantsbane," she said, with pride. Rob liked the sound of this less and less. He remembered Tormund, and the golden bands he wore on his arms, and how his laugh was always the loudest in every hall, though they stood at the very end of the world. Most of all, he remembered all the warriors who followed him, and the others who seemed to put their trust in him more each day. With Mance Rayder locked still in Winterfell's dungeons, that sort of man might style himself as king, and take whatever remained of his people south. Jon had trusted him. He had given the man command of Oakenshield, Rob remembered, and they had marched together to Hardham. And Rob held Tormund's son. The boy named Dryn had served as Jon's own page, and been sent to Winterfell along with the other children. There was something unseen here. "You may remain here for now," he decided. "I will give you shelter and food, and you will give me your weapons, and answers to each of my questions. Desmond will take you, and after you have supped, he will return you here, and you will tell me all that you know. If you do not see fit to agree to my terms, you will be escorted to Winterfell's gates and you may pass the winter outside my walls, in whatever manner you can. Either way, he would have his daughter." The wildlings had exchanged a look, and the chance that blood might be spilled here, in the room where he used to sit with his father and look over his shoulder, hung in the air. And then the one called RYK stepped forward, and at last Rob's daughter was in his arms. She looked up at him, seeing and not seeing him, before her face twisted, and she let out her cries. Rob might have kissed her then, and soothed her, but not here, not now, and so he waited instead, as RYK lay down his sword, wincing as though it pained him, and the girl stepped forward after him to give up her knife. As she did, she looked at his daughter with concern, and seemed as though she might have said something, and then thought better of it. Once they were gone, he ordered Jory to double the guard that watched over Mance Rayder's cell, and set more men atop the towers, to watch in case more wildlings lurked in the woods, perhaps Tormund Giantsbane's army, waiting for a signal to rush the walls. And at last, he looked at his daughter. She was so light in his arms, so small, but strong too. She had survived a journey from the wall, where grown men had perished, and the cries that came from her now told him nothing ailed her lungs. She was swaddled in a filthy cloak taken from the night's watch, wrapped so tightly that he had to lay her on the chair to undress her, and make sure she had no wounds nor cuts. Afterwards, he had wrapped her again in his own cloak, and sent Fat Tom to fetch Cregan's nurse. When his son was born, he had spent hours in the nursery, marveling at him, feeling so proud at every motion, very blink, every turn of the head or stretching of the fingers. But Rob had been half a boy himself then, and his world full of troubles. He had no such time for his daughter. Once she was in the care of the nursemaid, suckling peacefully at her breast, he found his way to Maester Lewin's tower. Maester Eamon was long in dying. Though he passed most of his days asleep, he clung to life and the hope that he might see his kin again, or their dragons, as Samwell Tarly told it. When the Black Brother was not caring for the old man, he assisted Maester Lewin, learning from him the healing arts. Rob found them at that task. He wrote a letter to John first, writing as quickly and briefly as he could what had happened, and the questions it left him with, and watched as Maester Lewin tied it to the leg of a raven, and sent it off into the sky, before telling the men all that had happened, and requesting their presence that evening when he would question the wildlings. Maester Lewin accepted with a nod, but Samwell had stammered, saying he did not know much of Tormund Giantsbane, and asked whether Benjen Stark would not be a more suitable choice. "My uncle shall be there, but you are a Black Brother too, Sam." But he had not chosen Samwell Tarly for his knowledge of the wildlings. The brother was right on that account, Benjen Stark was far better suited for those tasks. But Sam knew John, and not the quiet and thoughtful boy that Rob had known and loved, but the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who had sent his daughter south in the care of wildlings. They learned what there was to know that evening. Desmond brought the wildlings before him, and sat around the table was Maester Lewin and Samwell Tarly, Benjen Stark, Sir Roderick and Jory Castle, and Veon Poole, grim and meting out each word with care. The wilderling girl's name was Munda, and it was she who answered each question with her son strapped to her chest. She told of how things fared at Oakenshield when they left, of the Lord Commander and his dragon and the king and his, and the day that the princess had come on the largest of the three, carrying her babe. There were things she would not say, or claimed she did not know, and Rob could see it was sheer stubbornness, but what he learned left him so angry that he did not trust himself to speak. The girl told of the massacre of the wilderling women in the Gift with hate on her tongue, and how news of it came to her father on John's own lips. John and the king both had sworn to mete out justice to every man who had a hand in it, and Tormund sworn he would hold Oakenshield until spring came in exchange. But his daughter's life had not been bought so cheaply. It was not just promises they gave the wildlings but land in the Gift that they might farm and settle once winter was over. A chill pierced Rob's heart when he heard those words. When the wildlings were led away once more, he spun around to face his uncle. "John has gone mad. And Aegon." Rhaegar had refused Rob's calls to bring the Lannister men to justice, but his son had agreed, and not for justice, but because it suited him to weaken the North further, by setting wilderling loose at their borders. Rob would not speak that treason here. Benjen Stark looked as disturbed as he felt. If John has done this, it is because he saw no other path. Once the wildlings were allowed south of the wall, there was little hope they would return to their lands once winter passed. Samwell Tarly was nodding. "Their blood runs black," Rob remembered. "They will not speak ill against their Lord Commander, even before me. It is one thing to suspect that, and another to invite them onto my lands." His uncle frowned. "Those lands belong to the Watch, Rob. And do you think they shall build cities on them and farm the soil, as they never could beyond the wall?" he asked, incredulous. "No, they shall fail and venture south to rape and pillage as they have for thousands of years." Uncle Benjen went on, "I do not say it shall be easy, or that it was wise. But matters with the wildlings cannot return to what they were. Even your father had begun to see in Hardham. My father isn't here. Dead, my father is dead." He should have said it, but he could not. If his mother was here now, she would tell him he sounded like a boy, not a lord. She should have been here, he should have asked for her counsel, and he would have, had it not been for her grief over Sansa. And for Bran. His little brother had woken up screaming 2 nights ago, and had not spoken a word since then, hiding away in the Godswood, going so far as to sleep in the branches as he did when first learned to climb. Even Meera Reed and Arya could not coax him away. I don't know what he might do if he was. It ought never to have come this far. The king beyond the wall has been allowed to come to Winterfell, as was his sister's wife, and I hold 100 children hostage on the Lord Commander's behalf. Now I am giving shelter to every wildling that arrives to Winterfell, and in a year, or 2, or 10, once they have been loosed on the gift, I will have 1,000 more at my gates. What will my bannermen say when they hear of this?" Silence fell across the room. He had said too much, and felt only despair. What bannermen, one of them might have asked, if they had but the heart. There had been no word from Last Hearth, Carhold, Bear Island, Deepwood Motte, or the Drear Fort, and the people from Castle Serwyn had all fled to Winterfell. Half of his land was empty, save for the dead. Sir Roderick cleared his throat. "Your doubts are mine own, Robb." "And mine," Maester Lewin said. "But there is much that lies between us and spring. Now is the time to strengthen Winterfell's defences, and search for friends outside the north where we might find them." That was not easy work. Many of the lords of the great houses and their kin were lost too, somewhere on the wall still perhaps, or else scattered, or dead. He had sent ravens to Riverrun, Casterly Rock, the Eyrie, Sunspear, Highgarden, Storm's End and King's Landing. Of them, only his Aunt Lysa had not deigned to respond. The rest wrote of how dire matters stood in their own lands. The Tyrells and Martells and the Iron Throne marched to war, the only two kingdoms whose armies were not in the north, and Rhaenys Targaryen had sent what remained of Edmure Tully's forces in the south to hold the borders with the Reach. From the Bane Fort to the Weeping Tower there were riots, and empty villages, and hungry mouths. But Robb nodded. "Tomorrow, we must make quicker work of the pyres. Jory, choose some men to search for Dorne and make certain they find it. I would not have such a weapon fall into the hands of the enemy, and it must be returned to Starfall once the war is done. We have need of firewood and logs to re-strengthen the walls and build barriers. I shall lead a party to the Wolf's Wood at dawn." Uncle Benjen shifted in his chair. "I'll ride with you." "No," Robb said, firmly. "I would have you stay within Winterfell's walls. The wildlings fear no one as they fear you." Benjen Stark snorted. "Hate, perhaps. Hate or fear, it matters not, so long as they remember the Watch, and that they are not here by conquest or might but mercy." The only wildlings with free reign of the castle were the children, and the girl named Gilly, who nursed Mance Rayder's child along with her own. Robb had seen her but a handful of times, and she was a flighty, scared thing, staying within her rooms or else sitting in the library with Samwell Tarly, who Robb had a vague idea had saved her life somehow. The other was the wilderling princess, but there were ever men tasked with watching her from afar. The two women never spoke, but the arrival of Munder and Like troubled him. He could not put them in fetters, and yet, he could give them no chance to conspire. Lord Lewin frowned. "My lord, it seems to me that if two such wildlings carrying infants could survive a journey from the wall, that more will come." In his letter, the Lord Commander writes that the wall holds, but if what this girl says if true, he has flown north with his dragon. It could be the wall will face another assault and its people will have need to retreat south. And there will cravens surely who will flee, now that they find the enemy has gone. If all the other castles to the north have fallen, they will come here. How will Winterfell receive them? Will you send them away to their deaths, Maester Lewin seemed to ask, or give shelter to innocent and deserter both? At his own table sat two brothers in black cloaks, who had pledged their life and honor to the Night's Watch and were here now, safe in Winterfell's walls. But though they had left the wall, they did not abandon their vows. "Let us face that when the day comes," was all he could say. Perhaps thinking Robb meant to end the council early, Maester Lewin leaned forward. "My lord, there is another matter. Benfred Tallheart writes that they have need of weapons, and men to wield them. He says the castle will surely fall should the others return." Veon Poole shook his head. "We have few enough men as it is." "And we shall have less on the morrow," Robb said. "I have given Darin Hornwood leave to return to Hornwood." Lord Harley's Hornwood was lost and feared dead, and the castle and the forests around it had been spared in the attack. Robb would not have it be said that he hoarded the young soldiers for Winterfell and left the rest of the north undefended. And Darin had been a good friend to him. As had Clesa Wyn, Wendell Marndaly, Robin Flint. They were all dead now, save for Owen Norrie and Daisy Mormont. No doubt Daisy would say that she had lost the best part of her when her sword hand was taken. Maester Lewin seemed to think on his words for a moment and then nodded, as though to say Robb had not heard in that judgment. "We have swords enough to give, though Mickon can better judge how many, Jory said. We've been stripping them of the corpses we burn. Perhaps the loggers might take some wood to Torrens Square tomorrow and aid young Lord Benfred in reinforcing his walls, Mayor Stillowin suggested. Rob nodded, and gave his assent. Lord Stark, Samwell Tarly did not look at him as he spoke, but at the parchment that lay on the table before him and Mayor Stillowin, where they wrote down all that was discussed. I have been studying some of the tomes in your library. In the early days of the North, it was not uncommon for ladies to take up swords. The SS still do on BB Bear Island, and beyond the wall. There they call them SS Spearwives, and there is a record of a trader who passed Skagos, and saw women with obsidian spears guarding the shores. Rob remained silent, and let the Black Brother find his words. Jilly doesn't know how to fight, but she wants to learn so she can protect her babe if the others come back. Sam was blushing, though at the mention of the girl's name or for the effort it took him to speak up in a council, Rob did not know. He hoped it was the latter. What I mean is, Winterfell has more women than men now. Perhaps they can learn, if you need soldiers. The thought made Rob strangely uncomfortable. Sir Roderick scoffed, and then grew quiet, and began to tug at his whiskers. What do you say? He asked those gathered. I would have your counsel. Jory shrugged. Daisy Mormont was as fine a warrior as I ever saw. But they say the women of Bear Island are not like other women. Rob knew the rumors, and would not have them spoken of here. Sir Roderick, what say you? It will fall to you to train and prepare them. The man looked almost embarrassed. I shall do it, if my lord commands. But the swords will have to be remade so they are light enough for the women to wield. I shall speak with Mickon. All paths lead to Mickon, then Rob said. He felt bone-tired. Unless there are other matters, let us leave it there then. And so, he entrusted his uncle to tell his Aunt Lyanna was news had reached them of John, and his feet found him at last in the nursery, with his sleeping children. It took everything in him not to wake his daughter, and hold her a while, but she slept so peacefully, and her journey had been so long, that he contented himself with watching over her. Rob had never thought on what it might be like to have a daughter. He had not thought on marriage much, before his father told him he was to marry Daenerys Targaryen, and it was only to hope that his bride was beautiful. Once he was wed, they had both known without speaking of it that they must make a son to give Winterfell an heir of their blood. And then Cregan had come, and he spent hours thinking on all the things he would teach him, and all the things they might do together, and then, later, when war arrived in Winterfell, on how he might protect him, and make strong the seat that would one day be his, perhaps sooner than they had all hoped. Now that the dead walked, he thought only of how his son, and all those in Winterfell, might live long enough to see spring. And now there was another who he loved, and who he must protect. And she was only a girl, with no inheritance and no claim. Who would protect her, if not her father? Father? Cregan had awoken, was rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Rob went to him before he could wake the babe, and lifted him into his arms. Did you meet your sister yet? Rob whispered. Yes, his son yawned, and held tightly to his doublet. But she can't play. She's just a baby. Rob kissed the top of Craig's head. His son was learning more words every day, and the days of his clumsy steps were long past. Now, he ran everywhere, and left a trail of his nurses chasing after him. So are you? Rob teased, knowing the reaction that would come. Craig scrunched his face. No, I'm not a baby. Rob smiled at that, and settled back into his seat, the weight of his son resting on his chest, until Craig's little breaths grew slow and steady, and he was asleep once more. It was past midnight when his mother found him, looked wearier even than him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and leaned to give Craig a kiss as Rob had done, before walking to his daughter's crib. She takes after her mother, she said. Just as you do. I know that. Of late, every word that left his mouth sounded pointed, and cruel, even when he did not mean it. It was as though everything gentle and patient had been stripped away from him, and he was more of a beast now than he had ever been when he walked in Grey Wind's skin, and dreamt his dreams. His mother's mouth was a thin line. What name did Daenerys give her? An ill-fated one, Rob thought. Munda had told him. It was a name suited for these times, perhaps, but he did not such an omen to follow her through to days which he hoped would be brighter. The gods had not blessed the daughters of Alysanne and Giaris with sweet fates, he recalled, nor did many other Targaryen princesses. None, he lied, and was surprised at himself. Choose a pretty one for her. He had, long ago, thinking he would not live to see her. But his daughter had found his way to him, and it was Daenerys who was beyond his reach, almost beyond thought, somewhere beyond the wall with the other dragons and their riders, waging a war of their own. Robb found that he missed his wife. During the day he had little time to think on anything except what was before him, but when he returned to his bed each night, alone, the thought of her would come to him, unbidden. He would wonder where she was, if she still lived, and force the thoughts down. Sitting before their daughter, his soul filled with grief for her mother, and pity. She was a princess, born to a life of comfort and ease, and instead, my father named my son. It is only right that you name my daughter. It seemed to him his mother would have smiled, if she still could. Her name shall be Alara, she said, after a moment. For the daughter of Lord Alaric Stark. Her father once said she was as sweet to look upon as any Southron lady. Your daughter shall be fairer. Alara, Robb agreed. When at last he had been in the Wolf's Wood, it was on the death march to Winterfell, the snow blinding them, the dead reaching for their cloaks, and cutting them down one by one. The trees were full of screams, then, and the weeping of dying men and sounds of slaughter, where today there was nothing, save for the gentle whinnying of the horses, and the hacking and cutting of trees, and somewhere far ahead, the hiss of arrows that meant the hunters had found prey. His men held their tongues at his command, and exchanged only the briefest words when needed, their ears trained instead to listen for the sounds of the forest, and any enemies that lurked within. The whites were clumsy, and could not walk silently over snow any more than he could. They seemed to come before the others, though not always, and so his men knew to remain vigilant against the cold too, the cold that was not that of winter, but of death. The gates of Winterfell would not open to them should they retreat, chased by the dead. He had made certain every man who rode out with him knew that, but they could make their stands, and die at least with swords in their hands. There was no need for that, today. Nothing found them in the woods, neither man nor corpse, but other strange things were afoot. In some places, a frost seemed to grow before their eyes like weeds, and a blink later it was still, and common, and left a man shaking his head, and thinking he had gone mad. Long spears of ice hung strangely from the tree branches, in forms he had never seen, and the very ice below their feet did not crunch. He was alerted to the wolf's arrival with a whistle, and looked over to see Summer padding through the trees, his breath steaming before him. The dire wolf came to him, and pressed his snout against Robb's leg. "What are you doing here?" he asked, quietly. Was this Bran, in his wolf's skin? There was a time when Robb could tell, but that was gone with Grey Wind. "It's not safe here, go back to Winterfell." The wolf response was to lick his gloved palm. They worked quickly, and each man told himself it was because of the blizzard that was coming and not the disquiet in his heart, and when at last they turned to return to Winterfell, they looked over their shoulders and urged their horses on faster. Robb was glad to see the pyres were burning, and though the smell of the ones at Castle Black had turned his stomach, these had been more ably built so their smoke was carried from the easterly wind, and away from Winterfell. But there was nothing to do for the sight of flesh melting, of hair charring, of faces of the dead pulled at last from the ice, their bodies broken, their faces twisted in agony, awaiting their turn in the fire. Torgon Flint, the Val, and the Nari were somewhere among those corpses. So were Sir Barristan Selmy and Sir Arthur Dayne and 100 other good men no doubt, who had deserved a better death than this, and a better burial. He should have their bodies cleaned, their bones prepared and sent back to their kin, but he would have no corpses in Winterfell, no matter who they belonged to in life. To his surprise, Bran was waiting for them at the gates as they rode through. Summer bounded over to him, and Robb hastily dismounted from his horse and handed the reins to Hullen and went to his little brother. Robb tried to sound cheerful. "Bran. I'm glad to see you." Bran looked thin, and worn out, but when Robb placed his arm around him, his brother leaned into his embrace. "Tell them not to close the gates right away," his brother whispered into his ear. Robb looked over his shoulder to where the men were pulling the massive logs into the yard. Elsewhere, the hunters were pulling their kills down from the backs of their mounts. "Why not?" "Riders are coming." "Who?" "I don't know. I can't see." It seemed to lift a weight off Bran when he heard Robb give the command to set archers on the walls and watch for messengers, and instead of returning back to the Godswood, Bran walked with him and Summer. "Have you gone to see Mother?" Robb asked, carefully. Bran nodded. "She came to find me. I wanted to see the girls fighting." "Fighting?" Robb had already forgotten. "Sir Rodrik is teaching them how to spar. Meera's the best of them. Arya can move her feet faster," Bran said. "You should go see. When they are good enough, Sir Rodrik says he'll let them practice against the boys." In that moment, his brother sounded almost like himself. "Shall we go watch?" Robb asked, though he had 100 tasks ahead of him. Bran smiled and took his hand, as though he were a little boy once more, and together they followed the sound of Sir Rodrik's voice, calling out commands, and chatter and laughter. Jane Poole and Beth Castle were giggling together, their wooden swords in their hand, until Veon Poole called out to his daughter from where he stood to stop gossiping and heed Sir Rodrik's commands. He saw Josepha's twin daughters, Bandi and Shira, shyly looking for their father in the crowd that gathered to watch, and Pilla, smiling boldly, as she swung her sword clumsily through the air. Even Daisy Mormont had come, and was holding the sword in her left hand, her other hand strapped to her side. 40 women and girls he counted, among them Meera Reed and even his Aunt Lyanna, and at the front Arya stood, with a look of determination on her face, listening to Sir Rodrik intently. Their kinsmen who had gathered to watch looked on, some saying nothing and looking unhappy, others shouting out words of encouragement. Rukkan's voice rung out loud, cheering on Arya and their Aunt Lyanna both, and with each cheer, Shaggadog howled in the yard. Robb and Bran went to him, and found their mother at his side, watching Arya so intently that she did not notice their arrival until Bran, too, added his voice to the clamor. "She's doing well," Robb said, after a moment. Bran was right, their sister was quick. But it was his Aunt Lyanna who truly surprised him. She looked like half a warrior already. Robb found his Uncle Benjen in the crowd, and when their eyes met, his uncle smiled. His mother sighed. "She came to the yard and picked up a wooden sword before I could forbid her. Even now she will not look at me in case I should order inside." "Septa Mordane looks like she might explode," Rukkan said. He was right, the Septa's face was beet red as she whispered something to Septon Chael. "Hush," their mother warned. But Robb thought he could see her smile too. He could not linger long, much as he wanted to. Robb went to say his goodbyes to Darin Hornwood, and then saw to it that the wood they had gathered was brought in and counted, and once it was measured, began the hard work of cutting the pieces they would need for the walls, and stacking the rest for firewood. By mid-afternoon, he was drenched in sweat and ready to go soak his muscles in the hot springs when Owen Nuri found him, with news that a party was riding towards Winterfell from the east. Robb had long ceased trying to understand just what sort of magic his brother had learned beyond the wall. "Gather riders to go meet them, and bring me word when they have arrived. I shall be in the Godswood. I reckon you'll want to ride with us, Robb." Robb threw down the saw, and stretched his back. "I stink, and I ache. The last thing I wish is to do is mount a horse that smells worse than I do. You'll keep for an hour longer." Owen had a queer look to him. "I will. For there's a direwolf running with them." Chapter 53, Daenerys 14. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. The tears were freezing on Aegon's cheeks. One of the lessons Viserys had taught her was that the blood of the dragon did not weep. But her brother had not lived long enough to witness the horrors she had seen, the horrors she had done. There were some things for which the only answer was to weep, or else her heart would turn to stone in her chest. But it was too cold even for that. The tears did not fall from her eyes, as they had from Aegon's, and the pain she felt worst of all, worse than even the grief and the terror, was the stiffness in her fingers as her nerves froze, and she willed them to keep digging, to scoop out with every grasp as much snow as she could. They had ceased looking over the shoulder long ago. If they come again, let them come. They would fall against them, that was beyond doubt, but there were things worse than death. Dany. The wind was so fierce that it drove the snow into their eyes, and Aegon's voice was like a whine on the air. "I can't. I have to stop." The blood from the wound he had taken on his arm had frozen like ruby crystals on his furs. It was an ugly, painful thing. One moment the cut where the other's blade had pierced him would frost over, and turn to ice, and then Aegon would move, and it would open once more, and begin to bleed until the wind caught up with it. Despite that, and his words, he did not stop. He dug, as she did, working away with his hands, and then scooping his arms under, cradling the snow as one would cradle a baby, and throwing it to the side. The pain in her hands, in her knees, in her feet, made her want to scream. Daenerys chanced to glance up at the sky, pale and white and shedding so much snow that they had to shield the holes they had dug with their bodies so they would not fill too quickly, and let it settle onto their backs instead. Aegon let out a shout, and when she looked at him, her in her chest, he was trying to take off his gloves, only to find that they had frozen to his skin. "I hit a rock. Help, we're close. I have strength enough." She would not fail in this. The hole was 3 feet deep, at least, and the best she can do was to search it with her hands. She fingered a sharp rock, and then touched the ground with open palms, searching like a blind man, until she found more rocks, and crawled on her hands and knees to reach the place where the ground gave way and revealed the hidden opening, angled in such a way that snow did not fill the underground caves below but sealed it. "It's here." Aegon nodded and breathed in deep as though to prepare himself, and at last brought his arm up to his face, so that his tears fell like small rocks upon his sleeve. At some point he had lost the scarf that covered his face, and the skin of his lips was like the cracking sheets of ice atop a lake. Everything had already been agreed, and there was no need for words. The king brought Dark Sister to his side with one hand, and with the other gripped Daenerys, to bring her palms around its hilt. And then he disappeared once more into the cave, and all that was left to Daenerys to do was wait. To keep the fear, and the cold, at bay, she began to count the seconds, but lost track and studied the forest instead. If the others were there, it would already be too late for her, but perhaps she could cry out and warn Aegon and he might find the back entrance, and at least one of them might be saved. But the whole world was white, and it was hard to make out the sky from the ground, much less whatever shadows might be moving between the trees. Gods and monsters are not so far apart, Daenerys thought. They could both bend the world to their own uses. And yet she could not. The dragons were the only living creatures that could come close, but in the end, they were only that, living creatures that had need of food, and rest, and sleep. And for the first time since the Battle of Pike, when Euron Greyjoy had turned them against each other until they lay bleeding and wounded upon the shore, the dragons had spent their strength. Daenerys had flown her dragon as close to the ground as she dared when Jon and Aegon first journeyed into the cave, and from the sky done as Jon had said, and burned anything that moved, or that seemed to move. After that, she had pulled back and danced circles in the sky with Shadowtamer, waiting and watching, until she saw Aegon climb out of the ground, and turn, and pull at something and slice desperately with his sword. She could not hear the cry on his lips, but if it was for Seaflame, his dragon came to him quickly, first with small bursts of fire, catching on the trees and bringing brilliant light to the forest, and then landing on the melted ground to let his rider mount. The others were spilling out of the cave, and more rising from the woods, but it was Jon she had searched for then. His dragon seemed to do the same. Brytzen was drawing swift circles in the sky, flapping her massive wings so quickly it was as though she was conjuring up a storm of her own. Shadowtamer and Seaflame added their flames to each other, and burned the world together, as they had when they first left the wall together to clear the forests to the north. But this was not like that time. The dragons had been sated then, having gorged themselves on prey from the gift and grown lazy in their lairs. But since they had flown from the wall, there had been little rest, neither for them nor for their dragons. Each night they camped in a new place, and while one of them slept, a second took watch, and the third was in the sky was their dragon, watching the world from above. Of prey there was little and less with each passing day. Daenerys had felt Shadowtamer's will meet against hers. He wanted to leave, to fly alone and hunt, and come back to her only when he wished. And she had kept him close to her, because to let him leave would mean the end of her life and the end of the world, and he had obliged, and when she commanded him to spit out his flame then it had been as bright and terrible as anything. But then Seaflame's flame went out, as a candle suddenly might in a moment of greatest need and leave only the darkness, and Shadowtamer's had soon afterwards, and flew up rapidly, pulling the chains around her waist so tightly she thought she might empty her stomach. The dragons stopped only when they found high ground, bringing them up to the side of a mountain that was above the very clouds. Even here, Daenerys had thought, there is still beauty. Before her was a great white cloak unfurled, so unmoving and so delicate that it seemed as though each piece of it was placed there by some great purpose, the moon full and bright so it might better cast its light through it. It was the world only her dragons could have taken her to, and what a price she had paid for it. But it was not perfect. The air there was more than bracing, it was deadly. There was no hope in speaking, in shouting across it so that Egon might hear her, and so she had untied herself from her dragon and climbed off his scales to land softly in the snow and sink, 5 feet or more, until the ground had stopped her. When she had tunneled her way out she had found Brightson, without John upon her back. "Dany." Egon's voice came from within the cave, sharp as a whip, not a cry of fear but a command. And then he was before her, and in his arms he carried John, his body limp, a thin sheen of frost on his black cloak, on his hair, his face. No, not John. His corpse. Daenerys had known what she would find here, but seeing it was another matter. The wound that killed him made Egon seem but a mere scratch. The sword of the other had found John in the center of his chest, and a sick feeling grew in her that if she looked at it too closely, she would see his heart beneath the caked, frozen blood. It seemed by now she had spent her whole life in war, and heard all things soldiers say when they would look upon the corpse of their fallen kinsman. Most often they would say, "He died a good death," and she knew that would be said of John, who had given his life defending his brother and his king, but if such words gave men comfort, they did little to numb her grief. His eyes were open, looking at nothing, the eyelashes frosted over. "Help me," Egon breathed. "Take his legs." At his side, he carried a sword with a wolf's head pommel in his belt. Daenerys returned Dark Sister to him, which he slid back in its scabbard. The weight of it nearly took the breath out of her, and how cold he was. Would that they could carry him back to the wall to which he had sworn his life. She remembered the Lycoyard at Castle Black and its ancient tombs. But Castle Black was a world away, and John himself had decreed that no dead would be buried in the ground for fear they would rise again as whites. He was the Lord Commander, and the bastard of a king, and a dragon rider. If they could not give him a burial worthy of that, they could at least make certain some black magic would not take hold of him and raise him from the dead. It was no easy feat. The dragons kept the worst of the cold away, but it seemed to Daenerys that as their strength waned, so did the storms strengthen. On the horizon she could see where the blizzards had begun to wash over the world. It should have urged them, but no matter how hard she tried, she could not will her feet to move faster, nor could she ignore the pain in her arms and back. More than once she stumbled as they walked through the gloomy forests and over icy ridges, and Egon would wait for her, silent and grim, wincing in pain or catching his breath, and again they would lift up his brother, and march. There was no use in sweeping away their tracks, even if they had the time, or the strength for it. The others did not to read those to find them, and the snow was falling so quickly as to cover over them and leave the path pristine and white. With every hour, the snow fell faster, and the drifts grew deeper, and when they at last reached the camp, night had fallen. It was Seaflame, and Egon, who had found this valley at the foot of the peaks of the Frostfangs, surrounded by caves and ice rivers to the south. What little traces remained of the people who once lived here lay under the snow, but here and there the top of some thatched roof poked up, and stumps marked where trees had been cut down for firewood. To the north lay the great mountain range that separated them from lands unknown and the great sea she had learned lay beyond. It was there that Seaflame and Shadow Tamer had flown to seek out what prey still roamed there, if any still lived. Brightson was the one who remained, laid out on the cliffside so still, so silent, that for a moment she looked as she had when she was still made on Dragonstone, made of cold, dark stone. Daenerys wondered if Brightson mourned for John, and the thought made her feel sad, and lost. The place where they would rest might have been a storehouse, if the wildlings who lived here had use for such things. It was a simple structure made of pine and built into the side of the mountain. Within it, they found nothing of use save for a pile of firewood, and some knives that might have been for gutting fish. They laid John carefully on the ground at the far end of the room, and collapsed beside him, Egon grunting as he brought his hand to his wound, Daenerys silent as her legs gave out beneath her. But this place was not kind to the weak, and they had much to do. Egon uncorked his water skin, took a long pull and poured the rest over his wound, wincing sharply. From his cloak he ripped a strip of fabric with his knife and wrapped it around his arm, and then turned to Dany, and to John. He looked at his brother for a long, sad moment, and then without words, rose, and began to gather the firewood, and threw it, log by log near Jon's feet. She should have risen, for every step seemed to pain him, but instead she turned to the corpse of her nephew, and placed her hands over his eyes. It took a moment for his skin to warm, and the frost to loosen its grip on him so she could carefully pull his eyelids shut. Jon did not look peaceful, nor did it seem as though he were only sleeping. His hair was thick with the grime of their long journey, the look on his face was grim, and at the corners of his mouth there was dried blood. It stained his hands too, from where he had perhaps reached out to touch his wound. He knew what would meet him beyond the wall, she tried to tell herself, but it rang hollow. For the first time since leaving Winterfell, she thought of Lyanna Stark. Would such words give her comfort? Dany doubted whether anything ever would again. Aegon knelt beside her, and began to light the fire. Already? He winced. No. There isn't enough wood. I'll gather more, but I need to rest first. How much food do we have? In her pack, she had 2 loaves of bread and a handful of dried meat that had frozen and shattering into pieces. To that, she added what she found in Aegon's pack, the rest Jon had carried, and was lost forever in the caves. It could last them a week, perhaps, if they were cautious. They chose a piece each, and broke the bread with the hilt of a knife. With some water to soften it, it went together into Aegon's helm. Their cookware, such as it was tied to their saddles and over the fire. Daenerys warmed her hands, and as she watched the oil rise to the top of their stew, and when Aegon declared it done, and pulled it from the flame, they reached for it hungrily, and ate it with shame, knowing neither food nor drink would ever pass through Jon's lips again. The rest of their tasks passed silently. On the cold floor they rolled out their sleeping mats. Dany even dared to briefly take off her boots for the first time in days, and tried to rub the stiffness from her toes. When they at last lay to rest, it seemed as though there was nothing left in the world but the crackling of the fire and howling of the wind outside. We should say a prayer for him. He followed the old gods. Do you think they will hear our prayers? Perhaps not, but this isn't right. We should do more for him. We should. Her words trailed off. Her own brother's deaths had been similarly cruel. Viserys' ashes had been collected and taken to King's Landing and Rhaegar. Sir Arthur Dayne had carried his ashes. She could not begin to think where they were now. What we have already done for him is madness, Aegon said, as though she had thought of it, and not him. And then more gently, Jon would see that too. He would say we should have left him in those caves and flown our dragons to the wall, instead of risking so much for his corpse. Jon's face flushed with the red light from the fire where he lay. The shadows danced around him. It's not merely a corpse, she said, as she looked upon him. It's his soul. I know, was Aegon's reply, and it seemed to her tears were threatening to spill from his eyes. No matter what ill feelings or harsh words passed between you two, you should not carry with you. No matter what else, you shared the same blood. Aegon had told her about their disagreement, or at least, his half of it. She could not lie and say there was not cause for anger there, or that Jon had not disobeyed his brother, and his king. But neither could she absolve herself of her part in it. The lands that Jon promised to Tormund Giantsbane and his people were the price of her daughter's life, and that might mean little to others, to those to whom she was just another little girl out of 1,000, but even they could see the reason in what Jon had done, and the wisdom too. Aegon had disagreed, and said another man might take it for treason, that Jon had dared to deal in the king's name without his leave, and afterwards his anger seemed renewed. Jon loved you, as you loved him. I'm not certain of that. What? Perhaps he loved me, once, before he learned the word bastard and what it meant. Daenerys shifted to bring her knees up to her chest and hugged herself. That can't so. You can't know that. Whatever else they were, your brothers were princes, born from the same seed and the same womb, Aegon said, quietly. My father almost gave his kingdom for Lyanna Stark, and in the end, she won nothing, and earned Jon a black cloak. Where is there room for love in that? I don't know, she admitted. They could not look back, not now. In the morning they would burn Jon's body, and then they would wait for their dragons and cross the world again, where nothing awaited them but war and death. Suddenly, Dany felt as though she wanted nothing in the world but to sleep, and to forget. Aegon seemed to sense her feeling. Or perhaps, he wished to be alone with his grief, and brood on his dark thoughts of things long past. You should sleep. He inched closer to the fire. I'll wake you at dawn. Dany looked one last time at Jon's corpse. What will you do if he? She could not bring herself to say it, but she did not have to. Aegon drew Dark Sister from its sheath in silent response. When she slept, she dreamt an old dream. On Shadow Tamer's back she flew, high above the world, and felt the heat of him in her bones, in her blood. Atop her dragon, Daenerys Targaryen could fly to the ends of the world if she wished, but everywhere she looked for a place to bring him down, there were dead, wearing the faces of those she had known and loved. In that nightmare she wandered too long, and when she woke, it was with sweat slick on her body and the sharp pain in her breasts that had lingered since she was parted from her daughter. Jon was as they left him, and Aegon stood nearby, laying down a bed of sticks and branches on the hard, frozen ground. Dany wiped the sleep from her eyes. Is it dawn? Did you go out alone? It's the hour of the wolf. The pyre he was building was a small, clumsily made thing. He did not stop moving as he spoke. You should sleep then. Her whole body ached and she could have rested a lifetime longer if only they had the time, but the sight of Aegon had begun to worry her. He walked with a stiffness as though his whole body was clenched, and a fresh cloth was wrapped around his wound, already red with blood. I'll take watch until morning. He shook his head. I shall sleep later. We should do this now. I don't know how long. If Jon should, the words were hard to find, for the thought behind it was bitter. If he should change, I don't know how long it will take. We ought to do this now, he repeated. Daenerys Targaryen was no longer a virgin girl who could cower and let the men of her house face that which frightened her. They are all dead, she thought sadly. Viserys, who left behind a son in Dorne who would never know him, Rhaegar, who she had loved with all her heart and barely known, and their father, whose death was the sin that had brought her the dragons. Was it them who had awaited Jon in one of the seven heavens? Or had he gone to rest with his mother's kin? Rickard Stark and Brandon Stark had never been anything more than vengeful spirits in her mind. Would their shades meet Jon's as kin, or drag him down to torment in the cold crypts beneath Winterfell? If the dead spoke, it was in no tongue she could hear. The pyres which Jon had ordered built at Castle Black were so high that their flames seemed almost to lick the sky, but the one which was made for him was small, and low to the ground, made for one person and one person alone. She and Aegon knew their roles without having to speak of it. Just as they had done when they brought Jon here, Daenerys took his feet, which Aegon carried him from his shoulders, and together, they brought the stiff, heavy body so it would rest upon the wood. They could not bring his hands to wrap around the hilt of his sword, and so Aegon lay the sword named Longclaw at his side. It was Valyrian steel and would not melt, but whoever came upon this place would know that the man who wielded it in life had done so bravely, and died with it in his hands. The young king hesitated only a moment before lighting a branch from their campfire, and fed it to the pyre. It was slow to grow, and whether that was mercy or curse, Dany could not say. It seemed hours passed before the flames found the edge of Jon's cloak and the air that swirled began to turn black and red and orange. Her eyes followed it, up to the wooden planks that formed the roof, gaping here and there where the pieces had been brought together without skill, or where the cold had eaten away from it. She could see the sky, dark as tar and dotted with white snow. Her eyes followed the dance of the snowflakes back down, as they began to dust the world around them. On her lips they rested, and melted, and she tasted the salt of the sea in it, or perhaps it was only her tears. What shall we do now? Aegon asked, his eyes on his boots. Wait for our dragons. They need to gather their strength, as we do. And then. Beyond the wall, Aegon seemed uncertain as he never let himself appear in the company of others. It was to Daenerys he looked to then, as he did now, and despite her doubts and grief, she could not fail him, as they had failed Jon. Afterwards, I will fly to the wall, and you to King's Landing. It surprised him, as it did her. I have spoken the words that in my own heart I was too much a coward to face. We thought the enemy could be defeated by the dragons alone, but we were wrong. I didn't vanquish them in their land, no more than you and Jon did in that cave. They walk, and hunt, and soon perhaps they will raise for a second time all the dead that served them and fell. But there are still armies in the south. Mace Tyrell did not march his host, nor did your uncle. Bring them up to the gift, whatever it takes, and perhaps together we may push them back. Was this what Rhaegar would have done? It didn't matter. Rhaegar was wrong, just as they were. We have no time. Besides, what difference will a few thousand soldiers make where all the armies of Westeros failed? He is hopeless, and who can blame him? It is our only choice. The warmth of the fire was beginning to fill the room as flames nibbled at the tips of Jon's fingers. And then, all at once, quick as a blink, the world was dark, and cold. Daenerys stood stupidly for a moment, not understanding, at the waning tendrils of smoke that rose from Jon's corpse where a fire had just been raging, and growing, and using his flesh for fuel, and at the steam that rose from her own breath just as the goose pimples did on her skin. Aegon swept his arm behind him to shield her. Forgive me, Dany thought, as she reached over Jon to grab Longclaw, but the sword hilt was too hot, and she pulled away with a gasp. A great roar shook the room, and hot air was upon her like an oven, and when Daenerys looked up the roof was engulfed in jets of flame. Bridezan, she thought. Shadowtamer's flame was black, and Sea Flame's orange, but this was Jon's dragon. She pulled at Aegon and he pulled at her, and together they stumbled through the door as the burning wood began to fall around them. The dragon spat out another burst of flame on they were outside, aimed at the others that were gliding over the frozen lake. In some places the ice cracked and melted and broke, and sent them plummeting into the black water below, but in other places it held, and they continued their advance. They seemed to glimmer almost like stars, and moved with a grace that living men did not possess. Their only path was towards the mountain, and the line of snow-capped trees that began at the foot of it. The snow was too deep, the drifts thigh-high after the night's storm. Her heart leapt out when Bridezan took to the sky, and bathed the others anew in flame, and with a roar, she unfurled her wings and pulled herself into the sky, and Dany knew her fire was spent, and she was gathering her strength. They are gone, she said, quietly. Aegon was not so certain. He watched the lake for a long moment and then grabbed her hand tightly, and again they pulled each other along, up further towards the mountain where the trees pressed in close, leaning over them to make a white roof where the snow had settled on the branches, and found no purchase to fall below. The ground was uneven, the snow high and then low again where it had fallen over hard rocks and roots that made each step treacherous, and even the sound of their breathing seemed to be drank up by the wind that swirled among them. When the wisps of pale mist began to thread between the trees like greedy fingers, they ducked behind a thick soldier pine, and held still. Aegon took his hand back then, and wrapped both around Dark Sister's hilt, and leaned over to press his mouth close to her ear. When I step out from behind the tree, run and hide. No, she said, but there was no time to argue. Somewhere in the woods, the white shadows were speaking to each other in their strange language. And then there was a shout, and the shriek of steel against glass. Aegon threw her down onto the ground, into a hollow formed by the roots of the tree, and sprang up and disappeared. She heard curses, and cruel laughs, and the clash of swords until above the beating of her heart she could hear nothing, only the wind, and then, the faint sound of boots on snow. The enemy that followed them walked over snow as easily as though it were the King's Road, and she stepped out from her hiding place, with Aegon's name on her tongue. There was no trace of what had occurred, only footsteps and the gaps left behind in the snowdrifts where they had pushed their way through, and halfway down the hill they had climbed, Aegon stood with his back towards her. Daenerys ran towards him as well as she could, but a feeling crawled up her skin like cold, and a voice that said something was amiss. Her nephew held himself too stiff, and when she was nearly at his side, he held out his arm, to keep her back. Down in the clearing, a black figure was sat in the snow, looking out at the lake where their Bridezan was plundering its surface for fish. The fear came back as she realized who it was they looked at. Jon, she breathed. Was he? Is he? Aegon's face was still, and dark. Wait here was his command. But Daenerys had disobeyed him when he was foolish before, and she did so now, trudging after him in the snow until they stood no more than 10 feet from where her nephew sat. Jon, Aegon called out. In his hands, Dark Sister gleamed, and his voice shook. Jon did not turn. From here she could see where parts of his arms had burned, his clothes worn away, leaving behind red, ugly flesh. Jon, Dany said, but he did not turn, not until Aegon called out again, louder. His eyes were grey, she saw quickly, his feet bare where the boots had melted away perhaps, but not black and swollen. Neither with his hands, which dripped blood, and held tightly to Longclaw. He seemed to look at them without seeing them and turned his eyes almost languidly back to his dragon. Aegon's grip on his own sword seemed to waver then as he took a step forward, and then another, until he was at Jon's side. Slowly, he went to his knees and placed his hands over those of his brother. It woke something in John, and Longclaw dropped soundlessly into the snow. What had they done? He was dead when they placed him upon the pyre, there was no doubt of that. The wound the other had struck had gone through the very heart of him. But he had not turned into a wight. Had he? We would be dead if he had, she reminded herself, but it did not give her comfort. What was he, if not that? Dany peeled off her glove and reached for his hand, and ignored Egon's warning look. It was limp, and cold, and the blood that fell on her palm froze against her skin. His wound, when she dared to look at it, was just as it was before, terrible, and deadly. "You're so cold," she said, softly. "We'll build a fire and find some place to sleep. In the morning, all will be well." John pulled away, and rose with effort, wavering as he stood as though trying to find his balance. And then he began to walk, not towards the lake and to his dragon, but south, from the way they had come. "John! You're not well. You must rest." He did not seem to hear her, or else he ignored her. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" Egon asked, rising to follow him, and when he caught up, and held him by the arms to stop him, John said only a single word. "Ghost." Notes. Thank you so much for your comments and kind responses to the last chapter. I read and cherished all of them and will have the time now that the chapter is posted to go back and respond. Thank you for continuing to read the story and taking the time to share your thoughts. Unfortunately, unlike the Robb chapter, there aren't really any light moments here. I won't say too much because I suspect many questions will be answered in the next update or two, but I'll just say Dany and co are seeing a very small scale of the war here. From where they are standing it feels like nothing they are doing is making a difference, whereas things might seem very different elsewhere. One of the things that most fascinates me about the books is how thankless heroism is, and I hope that's something that I'm able to explore here. Each chapter is progressively getting harder to write, but the end is so close. Thank you for sticking in there with me. Chapter 54, Bran 6. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. On the night of Sansa's return, Bran's brothers and sisters had crowded into the room she shared with Arya, and spoke of everything, and nothing. When Bran had last seen her, he was bidding her farewell before left to Carhold, to marry Harry. Sansa seemed frightened, then, though she tried to look brave, and he'd promised her that he would visit her so as to make her smile. The day she returned to Winterfell, she hadn't looked scared anymore, only tired, and pale-faced, and sad, and when she saw him, she let out a great sob and embraced him so fiercely that he'd complained he would be squashed. "I thought you were dead," she cried into his ear, and Bran was reminded of everything he wanted to forget. Arya had pushed past him then, and Rickon came running next, and once their greetings were spent and the tears dried, they climbed into Sansa's bed, like they used to when they were babies, and listened to the sounds of their wolves howling together outside. Their mother sat with them, with one arm wrapped around Sansa and the other reached out to Bran, squeezing his hand tightly. Uncle Benjen and Aunt Lyanna had come too, and sat with them a while, and Harry Carstuck, who had found Sansa and his sister Aelys and 100 of his people in the Lost Hills journeying to Winterfell and come back with them. Bran's good brother had shaved his great, black beard, and cut his long hair, and when he leaned to kiss Sansa's hand, and bid her good night, Bran thought he looked almost like one of the knights in Sansa's old storybooks. He told Sansa as much, but her face had turned red as a beet. Even Robb had come, carrying Credge, sleepy and yawning and grumpy. Sansa cooed over him, but he pulled away, and wrapped his arms around Robb's neck. "Alara's sleeping, but you can meet her in the morning." Sansa smiled, "He's grown so big." Robb smiled too, but Bran could tell it wasn't for true. "Maester Lewin says he's tall for his age." Gently, he cupped his son's face to draw his attention. "Aren't you, Credge? And you're learning your words quickly too." The baby only yawned at that, and rubbed his eyes. Then their brother turned back to them. "If the gods are good, you'll have a son of your own soon, Sansa." She blushed again at that, and it seemed to Bran that Robb and their mother exchanged a look. "I thought Carhold and everyone in it was lost." "I never thought I would see you again," Robb said, and for a moment it was their brother speaking, not their lord. But only a moment. "This room will always belong to you and Arya, and you may sleep in it as long as you wish. But come morning, You must be the Lady of Carhold, too. Sansa bit her lip. Alis thinks Lord Rickard and her brothers might live still. Harry does not, nor do I, Robb said, bluntly. All that remains of his house are those of his blood who are in Winterfell now, the 100 soldiers that survived the wall, and the 300 that came from you from Carhold. How many did Lord Rickard set out with at the start of the war? Bran should have known that for all the councils he had sat in, but so many things floated around in his mind and he couldn't remember. 400 seemed awfully few, and from the way Sansa's face had gone white, he thought perhaps she thought so too. When spring comes, it shall fall to you and Harry to rebuild it, their mother said, firmly but kindly. If spring comes, Arya murmured. When spring comes, mother said again. Aye, when spring comes. With those words, Robb brought an end to it. And until then, there are things we all must do, and duties we must face. Your husband's cousins are hard men, and Arnulf Karstark is the worst of them. He has 2 sons and 6 grandsons and a dozen granddaughters, where all that remains of Rickard Karstark's line are Harry and Alis. Arnulf has lived through many winters, and the survivors who marched with you from Carhold may find it easier to look to him and not their young lord. They must not, for Harry Sake, and for yours. Sansa was quiet, as though trying to understand. And for ours, too. Yes. For Winterfell, Robb admitted. The man who leads his people through winter will be the one they follow in spring. That man must be Harry and you must help him. Credge began to fuss, looking around this way and that, pulling away so he might be put in the ground. Sighing, Robb stood and pulled him close. I should go. He needs to sleep, and Maester Lewin is waiting for me. Think on what I have said, Sansa. There had been a moment earlier, when Arya and Sansa were getting along, and Rickon was going on all sorts of nonsense, and their mother was smiling, that it felt almost like before, and Bran could pretend that their father would walk in too. But that moment was gone, and their father was dead, and Robb would never be just their brother anymore. Perhaps Sansa thought the same, because when Robb was gone, she turned to their mother and asked whether father's bones were in the crypts. Arya had gotten that angry look to her face then, and Rickon began to chatter on about something else, but their mother had smoothed Sansa's hair and told her gently that the only thing that was brought back from beyond the wall was ice. Sansa started crying then, and Bran did too, because he had seen it through the weirwoods, and could never forget it, and tried with all of his strength in all of his dreaming never to return to it. All the while their mother told them that there was no shame in tears, that tonight they could shed as many as they wished, but tomorrow they would have to be brave. It was with those words in his mind that Bran fell asleep, his head in his mother's lap, and walked in old dreams that now were full of the faces and places that had only been whispers before. Bran was standing with his father in the Godswood, the air full of the smells of earth and leaf, the world quiet, and still, and peaceful around them. A nice dream, for once. His father looked just as he remembered him, his eyes soft, a small smile on his face and only a few greys in his hair, and suddenly Bran was not looking with his own eyes anymore, but with the eyes of a bird, and he could see himself. He wasn't a boy anymore, but a man, taller even than Robb, and his father was telling him, "Be brave, Bran." The storm came next, and Bran knew at once it would be a dream full of terrors in the end. In the white world of snow and silence, he saw Carhold and its banners of white starbusts on black, saw its walls falling, one by one, until only a tower remained with candles glowing red in its windows. The whole world went quiet then, and even the ravens stopped squawking. He saw that waver too, until the whites fell, like a great exhale, as they had in Winterfell, and the tower emptied, and a long line of people staggered out, led by a giant wolf. On the horizon, white shadows watched. In other places, men slowly emerged from beneath ruined castles and hidden caves, and stepped forward into the snow and towards the granite walls he knew to be Winterfell. Bran had learned that the worst thing to do in a dream was rush forward in fear. Each time he did, when he began to think that the things he watched through the eyes of a weirwood, or a bird, or a beast, could reach out and touch him, it seemed to send ripples to them, and then they would turn with those blue eyes like chips and see him, truly see him and begin their hunt. It was what had happened in the land of Always Winter, when he'd thought he could help Daenerys, and what had happened in that cave, when he searched for Lord Brynden and found terror and death instead, and saw Jon fall and the king weep for him. He put aside those thoughts now and tried to search for the things Robb was always asking about, for wildlings, for whites, for others. Except Rob didn't understand what he was asking for, not truly, no matter how many times Bran tried to explain it. He thought it was like looking across a great big map, like the ones he kept in his solar, except the map could be of yesterday, or tomorrow, or 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ahead. Perhaps Lord Brynden would have taught him that lesson once, or Hojan, but they were both gone, and all Bran could do was stumble alone. Sometimes, he would even see different paths dance around before him, and have no way of knowing which was the one to follow, and the one to come. One moment, it was Winterfell overtaken, and everyone he loved rose from the snow as whites, and another it was spring, and the gates were open, and the air smelled like flowers. Other times still, his home stood burned and smouldering, a husk of what it once was, and the men who walked about it, and sat in the seat of his father, and Robb, wore unfamiliar faces and spoke in strange tongues. But it was the first vision that lingered the longest, and had sent him to the Godswood, to climb and sleep in the branches of the heart tree and hope to dream another dream. He had, at last, and it was that same one which found him now, of dragons flying under a dark black sky. Even through the dream, through whatever ancient magic brought him to them, he could feel their heat, and see the fire behind their teeth. If he could, he would have spent all night with them, but he pulled himself down to the ground instead and saw a great white wolf padding through stone ruins that stretched to the left and to the right, as far as Bran could see. One moment the ruins were simple stone, and another they were like a great, bloody wound that had cut open the world. The dragon riders were huddled around a dying fire. "Hello," he called out, and searched their faces for a sign that they might have heard him, but Daenerys was sleeping, and King Aegon looking at the horizon intently, and Jon. When Bran looked at Jon, he pulled away, screaming. When Bran opened his eyes, he was in Winterfell, in a warm bed with a fire crackling merrily in the fireplace. His mother was asleep, as was Rickon, but Sansa and Arya were staring at him, their faces troubled. "What's the matter?" he asked, groggily. "You were crying," Arya said. "I wasn't crying. I was only sleeping." "You were crying. Your cheeks are wet." "No." Rickon stirred, but did not wake. "Hush, you'll wake them," Sansa whispered. "You were having a bad dream, Bran, that's all." "It's all right." Her hand found his. "I have them too." Bran wanted to protest, as he always did when anyone but Meera or Robb came near to the truth of what he was, but instead, he squeezed his sister's hand. "What sorts of dreams?" "Most of the time I dream of father. Carhold's Maester gave me sleeping draughts, but he died too, and then the dreams grew worse. I used to dream of you, Bran. You were all alone, lost in dark, and even Summer couldn't find you." Sansa hesitated, and seemed to hold back tears as she spoke. "But everything is better now. We're all safe here, and we shan't have any more nightmares." Arya scowled. "That's not true." "What are you talking about?" "We're not safe here," Arya said, quietly. "Yes, we are," Sansa insisted. "No, we're not. We're not safe anywhere." Sansa bit her lip. "Winterfell is the strongest castle in the north. It won't fall, everybody says so. Robb won't let it." When Arya said nothing to that, Sansa turned to him. "Robb won't let anything bad happen," she repeated. "He'll beat them, just like he beat the Ironmen." "Yes," Bran said, because he wanted to believe it too. "Robb will beat them." Neither of his sisters said anything for a long while, and as Bran shifted in the bed, he looked up and saw that his mother was awake. He closed his eyes again, and pretended to sleep. Everywhere Bran went in Winterfell, there were animals, or mothers chasing after their children, or soldiers who looked as lean and hard as Robb. The yards were full of men and girls practicing their drills, or waiting outside the kitchen for their rations, and in the Godswood, kneeling before the heart tree. Sometimes, in his dreams, Bran could hear their prayers. His Aunt Lyanna prayed for Jon to return to her safely, Sir Roderick prayed Beth would never have to use the sword he was teaching her to wield, Gage prayed that the hunters would come back with game, and everyone prayed for spring, and the end of war. Bran wanted to climb up Winterfell's towers, to look out across the world from on high and see what he could see with his human eyes, not Summer's eyes, or the eyes he dreamt with, but instead he spent his day in Robb's solar, seated too far from the window to even look out. Sometimes, Robb would meet with Maester Lewyn alone, or Sir Roderick and Jory, or their uncle Benjen and their mother, and no one would know what they had spoken of behind closed doors. Today, his table was crowded. Bran sat at his right side beside Harry on Carstark, his mother on the other. Across one side of the table sat Maester Stillowin, Sir Roderick, Jory, Veon Poole, and Uncle Benjen. Across the other side were Owen Norrie and Dacey Mormont, and Arnulf Karstark and his sons, who spent the better part of a half-hour speaking of their journey from the Carhold. Next to Dacey sat Moira Reed, who Robb had invited for the first time, after Bran's insistence. Every once in a while, Bran looked across the table and met her eyes. She smiled each time. After the Karstarks had finished their boasting, the talk turned to rations. It had been months since they'd had a proper feast, with plates of food and flagons of mead passed across the benches and tables. Now, each man took his plate from the kitchens with his meal already doled out. Sometimes there was game, but often it was only vegetables, and never any sweets. Mother had gone to the storerooms and spoken to Gage, and it was decided that most of the meat would be dried, and the rest would be portioned out once a week. Cregan Karstark grumbled about that, and said he would lead a hunting party to the Wolfswood himself, but fell quiet when Robb charged him with the task. When he first began to join his brother's councils, Maester Stillowin had bid him listen, so he may learn what lordship was about, and he did listen, no matter how dull it seemed, and tried to watch the faces of the very same men whose prayers he heard before the heart tree, and so when Dacey Mormont spoke, he could tell it was for the first time. Lord Stark. She rarely called his brother that, it was usually Robb. I ask a boon of you, and pray you will grant it. You gave Lord Karstark leave to journey to his lands. He met what remained of his people on the road, by the grace of the gods. I ask only the same of you. No ravens have returned from Bear Island, but that does not mean my kin are dead. Give me leave to go to them. Bran liked Dacey, who had stayed loyal to Robb even though she'd lost her hand defending him. They were all looking at Robb. Bran did too, but he couldn't tell what his brother might say. My lady, what path do you mean to take? Dacey answered him readily, south, at first, through the borders of the Wolfswood, and then I shall cross to Deepwood Motte and take a ship from there across the bay. That didn't seem to be the answer Robb wanted to hear. We've had no word from Deepwood. Lady Sybil and her children may greet you at its gates, or it may be death and destruction you face. I don't know the state of their ships, nor what you will find in the waters. I do not need a ship. I need only a boat, and 2 oars, and I can craft them myself. Bran glanced at Dacey's hand, and quickly, looked away. You are not a prisoner here, Dacey. Robb looked around the table and met each man's gaze. None of you are. You all know what awaits us outside Winterfell's walls. If any of you still wish to leave, I will give you no more and no less than what I granted Lord Karstark, and Darin Hornwood after him. Arnulf Karstark spoke then. He was gaunt and bent and crooked, with a left shoulder half a foot higher than his right's, a scrawny neck, squinty grey eyes, and yellow teeth. As talk has turned to prisoners, the man began, stroking his forked, ragged beard. Mance Rayder is in your dungeons, I've heard. I was all Robb said. Arnulf Karstark leaned forward on his blackthorn cane, as though to hear better. That man is a turncloak and oathbreaker, and that's the best I can say of him. For years he's sent his people to rape our women and raid our shores, and for years I've wished to look at his face and hear his last words. If my lord is granting boons, I ask for his head. Robb was still as a statue. He did not move, nor waver. I do not grant you that boon. The old, grey man smiled, and there was something sour in it. You would save that task for yourself, Lord Stark. Mance Rayder is the king's prisoner, not mine. The king is dead, one of Arthur's sons said, the one with a round, soft face. Rhaegar Targaryen is dead. But King Aegon lives, Maester Stillowin said. Arnulf Karstark snorted, lost beyond the wall, I hear. Perhaps. Though dragons are not so easy to kill, as our own ancestors knew, Robb said, evenly. Mance Rayder will keep a while longer. We will leave the matter there, for now. It was a dismissal, though some men were quicker to accept it than others. Dacey was the first to leave, but Harry lingered, and spoke to Lady Catelyn, while Owen Norrie exchanged some words with Moira that Bran could not hear. They left together, and Bran would have gone after them, but Robb motioned for him to stay. Their mother and Maester Stillowin remained too, and when everyone else was gone and the door closed behind them, Robb sunk into his seat. Mance Rayder shall be the end of me, he grumbled. Mother seemed disquieted. Arnulf Karstark and his sons are testing you, as Rickard Karstark, and Jon Umber, and Roose Bolton did before him. And found what? Those men you named all died under my command, Mother. Their mother gave Robb a challenging look. They found the son of Eddard Stark, and in him their only hope for surviving winter. The Karstarks are here, are they not? They know Winterfell is all that remains to them, or else they would have added their voice to Dace's and asked your leave to return to Carhold. Instead, Arnulf put Mance Rayder before you. Daisy is another matter. Robb frowned. Her wish is noble, Maester Lewin decided. And her intent admirable, though wish and intent matter little in times such as these. She will not make it across the sea. No matter how many men you send with her, they will be doomed. I sent 5 riders with Harry on. I cannot grant her less than that. One of the buttons on Bran's doublet had started to come undone. He was fiddling with it, when his mother addressed him. What do you think, Bran? About Harry? About Daisy? Do you believe Robert, or were his words well chosen? Mother asked, not unkindly though it was the tone she used when she asked after what he learned in his lessons. You did not speak up during his council, but now you have the Lord of Winterfell's ear. What will you tell him? Bran thought hard. Of late, he had only brought his mother grief. He wanted so badly to please her. I think Daisy is glad for Harry that his family is safe, but it must make her sad too. Bear Island is so far away, and her sisters don't even have a direwolf like Sansa. But I think it's not safe for anyone to leave anymore now that the wall is gone. Robb should have told her so, Bran decided. Everyone was staring at him. Robb sat up suddenly in his chair and Mother was frowning, and Bran knew he had chosen wrong. You are mistaken, Bran, Maester Lewin said. We discussed many matters today, but not the state of the war. How did you come to such a tale? It had come out all at once, before he could think twice, but now that the words were said, he knew it was true. It was what he had seen in his dreams, though he had not understood then. He understood now. The wall had fallen, or would fall, and it was in its ruins that Ghost walked, and Aegon, Daenerys, and Jon made their camp. Robb understood, if Maester Lewin didn't. He bolted from his seat and was out of the door before Bran could say more, leaving the Maester to rush after him. And then Bran was alone with his mother, who didn't take her eyes from him. Why did you say that, sweet one? His mother asked, gently. I don't know. It wasn't a lie, not really. Mother reached out to him, come here. He did as she said, all the while his heart beating hard in his chest. She wrapped her arms around him, and turned him so she might look into his eyes. You never could lie, do not begin to try now. Tell me why you said that. Did you see it in a dream? Suddenly, he felt cold all over. Did Robb tell you? He swore he wouldn't. Your brother revealed none of your secrets, though perhaps he should have. I have eyes and ears of my own, Bran. I know you sleep too much, and when you wake you go to Robb, and find some place to speak away from anyone's ears. And I know that afterwards, Robb shares matters with his council that he has no way of knowing, and yet each time, they come to pass. It is you who brings him those tidings. Tell me I am mistaken. You're mistaken, Bran said, weakly. His mother sighed and placed a hand on his cheek. I'm your mother, Bran. No one loves you as I do. If you can't put your trust in me, then who can you trust? He trusted Robb, who never had time for him anymore, save to ask after his dreams. He trusted Meera, but he always had to be brave in front of her even when it hurt in his heart. Unbidden, tears came to his eyes, and as they fell from him, so did the truth, all of it, that which he had hidden from his mother, and evaded with half-formed lies, and weak excuses. He told her all that had passed since he journeyed north, of how he had fled the battle for Deepwood like a coward, of the night fort and the long path through the snow, of the cave at the end of the world and their flight south, of the things he had dreamed and done. He told his mother of dragons, and princes, and kings, and of his father, dead in the Weirwood Grove, of Summer and all that he was, of Hojan Reed, and how he had died for him. And he even told her of Jon, using whatever words he could grasp, and when it was done, he sat sniffling and red-eyed in her lap. Are you angry? Do you think I'm a beastling? His mother looked weary, and sad. Never, she said, and leaned forward and kissed his forehead. Never. Daisy didn't end up leaving after all. No one did. Ravens came from every part of the wall, from their great-uncle the Blackfish in the Torches, and Iron Emmett at Long Barrow, and Prince Oberyn Martell at the Woods Watch by the pool, telling of how great sheets of ice were falling off the wall, of how it was melting at some places despite the freezing cold, of how the whites lay dead but the white shadows were rising once more in the forests and woods. Some wrote asking for counsel, but others did not wait for Robb's reply. Tywin Lannister's forces returned to their lands, risking the sea route so they might join the war that was brewing in the south, and Stannis Baratheon wrote to say that the Shadow Tower and West Watch by the bridge could not be held, and so he would make for Last Hearth. Robb had ordered Winterfell's gates closed, but in the weeks that followed it seemed that every day someone came stumbling from the snow, searching for shelter. At first it was small folk who had come from as far away as Long Lake and the mountains, who Robb said had survived the Whites' invasion and fled to Winterfell before another wave could fall upon them. They were a grim and sad-looking people, and they never smiled, even when Robb welcomed them to Winterfell and promised them his protection. Bran would watch from the covered bridge each time the gates opened, and men and women ran out to see if someone they loved had survived, if one of the refugees was their kin. Once or twice it happened, and they would cry out to each other, or fall to their knees and thank the gods, but more often than they wouldn't, and they would shuffle their feet and make their way back inside. Sometimes Rickon would stand with him, and make up stories about the people who arrived, showing off the names of the houses and clans Maester Stillowin was teaching him and guess which was a Vul, a Hartley, a Knott, deciding this woman was a Liddell, and that one a Norrie, and the other a Flint. Bran didn't mind the company, except when Rickon started asking why they hadn't brought any children with them. They've come from faraway places and children are too weak to survive. Oh, was all Rickon said. Bran turned to look at him. Why do you ask? Don't you like playing with your wilderling friends anymore? Rickon was as wild as Robb's hostages, and had fallen in with them straight away. Most days they could be found pelting each other with snowballs, or building snowmen along the battlements until someone came and chased away. Rickon scrunched his nose. They're boring. We play the same games over and over. Play with Credge and Alara then. Robb says I'm making Credge bad. And Lara's only a girl. I don't like playing with girls, his brother declared. You never want to play anymore. Bran wouldn't have minded playing rats and cats, but of late Rickon's play meant racing around the walls, tossing bones to the pups in the kennels, and stealing the wooden swords that the girls used when they practiced their drills. Old Nan said punishing him only made him more stubborn. Go play with Arya, Bran told him. His brother had stormed off, and that night when they dined, loudly asked Robb if he could make another baby, a boy this time, so he could have someone new to play with. Robb stared at him, speechless, and then looked away, as though he hadn't heard. It was Aunt Lyanna who had filled the silence, and promised they would play monsters and maidens together if Rickon behaved. Rickon never came to stand with him on the bridge after that, but once Arya did, though she had gone on and on about all that Sir Roderick had taught her and gotten cross when Bran said he could beat her at swords if he wanted. Other times it was Hodder, and sometimes Moira, though Owen Norrie always came looking for her after a while. Bran didn't mind Owen too much, but he didn't like how Moira smiled at him. It was the same smile girls used with Robb, except Robb would never smile back, and Owen always did. Most of the time, Bran was alone with only Summer for company. He told himself he didn't mind, that after all the hours he spent inside in Robb's solar that it was nice, but the day the knights in the white cloaks came, he wished someone was at his side so they could race each other down to the yard. The snows were heavy, and growing worse each day. In some places they were piled as high as his head. But before the last blizzard, people had stopped coming forward when the gates opened. Bran supposed they had lost hope. There were only a handful to greet the men that came in, dragging their feet and covered in a crust of snow that made them all look like snowmen. But there was no mistaking the pure white cloak of the Kingsguard. One of the knights wore a helm fashioned in the shape of a lion's head and golden armor, and Bran knew he could be none other than Jaime Lannister, while the other was Oswell Whent, with his helmet emblazoned with the black bat of his house. The men they travelled with had grown their hair and beard so long that Bran could not see their faces, but the one who was 7 feet tall and twice as wide as Hodder was the Great Jon. Bran remembered him from when his father had called his banners to march on the Ironborn. Other men he could not name, though some carried themselves with a lord's bearing, even now. Bran would have shouldered past them and gone to greet the king's knights, but Jory was at his side, his hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps you ought to let them rest first, Bran." A few of the men began to fall to the ground, as though their legs had carried them this far and could not make it any further. Others crowded around them and tried to bring them to their feet, calling for water, or a maester, but others could not be roused and lay still and silent in the snow, their eyes open and unblinking. Bran had seen dead men before, but it felt worse this time, knowing they had made it all the way to Winterfell and died anyway. When he looked away, he saw he was being watched. A squat, short man with a thick neck and a hard ale belly stood apart from the others, and stared at him from beneath eyebrows that looked like two huge beetles. Around his neck hung a chain of many metals. And then Bran recognized him. He was the king's maester, the one they called Marwyn the Midge, who had been at Castle Black with them. Bran raised his arm and waved. The maester waved back. More people died later that day. There was no room for them all within Winterfell's walls, and so they had set up crude shelters against the inner walls. 2 men had pulled a passing kitchen maid into theirs and done something bad to her, and so Robb had brought them out before everyone with their hands tied, and took their heads off with ice. That seemed almost forgotten when night came. The Great Jon had brought as much of his stores as he could salvage from Last Hearth, and they had taken down a herd of elk 5 leagues outside Winterfell, so there had been meat enough for most everyone. The great hall was fit to bursting as each man was given his plate, full with the roar of fire and the murmur of 100 conversations. Robb barely touched his food. He passed the evening in the deep talk with the men who had survived, among them Sir Jaime and Sir Oswyl, and lords from the Crown lands who had travelled with the Great Jon from the Wall, and Lord Dustin, who had been their father's friend and went to each of them to say how sorry he was for their loss. Bran could hear little over the din over the hall, but he had tugged on Maester Lewin's sleeve, and asked if the Umbers hadn't returned Robb's letters because they'd eaten their ravens, like Arya had told him they'd done at Carhold. "Oft-times the birds are lost, child. There's many a mile and many a hawk between here and Last Hearth," the Maester told him. "Best you don't ask Lord Umber such questions. He's mourning for his son. Jon Umber is lost in the gift." Across the benches, there was no singing and few smiles, and the men who were in their cups did not stand up and shout, or jump upon the table and boast, but sat quietly and stared off into nowhere. When the knights of the King's Guard rose, Bran had gotten up too, half knowing what he might say when he reached them, only that the sight of their cloaks made him think of his lost dreams of one day joining their number, and the memory of that dream made him both happy and sad. But even as he followed them out of the great hall, he remembered that it wasn't only the Great Jon who had someone to mourn. The King's Guard were a sworn brotherhood, and they were the only 2 left. He'd wondered then, thinking on whether it was best to return to the hall or go look for Summer or return to his room altogether, and just when he decided, he felt a tug on his shoulder, pulling him into the shadows, and a hand clapped over his mouth to muffle his cries. Bran struggled, and twisted, and turned enough to see it was a man with bristly white hair, and teeth stained a mottled red. Marwyn. He might have cried out, if anyone could hear him. Notes. Thank you so much for all of your comments on the previous chapter. I appreciate it so much and get so much joy and inspiration reading them. We are back in Winterfell again, though through the eyes of quite a different POV. I always love writing Bran chapters because of how much is lingering under the surface. His education with Bloodraven was cut short, and he doesn't fully understand the true potential of his powers, despite the fact that his actions have already had massive impacts, some clear, some unclear at this point. It's also quite fun to explore these massive changes happening from the perspective of someone who's still very much a child, despite how grown up he feels. In this case, Winterfell basically becoming a refuge for all the people who survived the Whites' attack, and used the break in the storm to escape their destroyed keeps, or their inadequate shelters. I hope you enjoy reading it. Chapter 55, Jon X. Chapter text. 2 figures were huddled over at the far end of the cave. "It'll be alright," one was saying. "It's only for a few hours." The other looked at him, and then away. "What if I don't come back? What if something happens? If you don't go, we'll starve. Then we'll go together and leave him. And if he wanders off again?" The other was silent a moment. "Hold on to Longclaw. If I'm not back by dusk, then you'll know I'm not returning. Don't wait, then. Keep moving south. Promise me." I promise. Be careful. You as well. Afterwards, the smaller one walked over to him and sat before the waning fire. The cave seemed like rot, and damp, and blood. When John looked across the fire, he met purple eyes, and a faint, awkward smile. In its hand it held a metal stick, with a top fixed upon it in the shape of a snarling wolf head in pale stone. His fingers went to his chest, and he touched the wound there, pushing past the tattered cloth that covered it, past skin and tissue, until he reached the hard muscle below, expanding and shrinking, over and over. When he pulled his hand away, it was red. "You shouldn't do that," came the voice. "You'll hurt yourself. Here." It fumbled in a bag that lay at its feet, and brought out something small, hidden in its hands, and came towards him. It was frightened and trying not to seem so. He had seen it 1,000 times with prey, who would growl and bare their teeth and make themselves larger, only to dart away, or to perish between his teeth. It sat at his side, and showed what was in its palms. "It's a needle, see? And this is catgut. We can use it to close your wound." "Needle. Needle," it repeated. "No, she. It was a woman. You're mine. Mine, as I'm yours. And if we die, we die. All men must die. But first we'll live." He remembered a crooked smile, and crooked teeth, and red hair. He remembered. He remembered a mouth, and the way it kissed him, and a smell he loved. No, no, it was a woman, but the wrong woman. This one was silver-haired, and purple-eyed, and so small and slight. She opened the water skin that had been tied to his belt, and poured it over chest. It felt like nothing, as light as wind brushing against him, but it made him feel other things, like cracked lips, and throat dry and parched, and he reached to take it, and grabbed the hand that held it. The woman flinched, and gave it to him, and turned to the objects in her hands, guiding the catgut through the needle's eye. As she tended to his wound, John drank. The water tasted as sweet as honey, and though it made his stomach cramp, he could not stop. John watched as she sewed him up, her hands shaking, growing redder and redder with his blood until it dripped down her wrists. Every once in a while, she pulled away, and wiped it on her clothes, but it kept spilling and spilling, until she put in the final stitch. John reached to touch it again. "You'll hurt yourself again." He ignored her, and did it anyway. There were bumps now in his skin now where she had pulled it together, weaving his flesh together like the edge of a tattered cloak. She bit her lip. "How do you feel?" He could not think of the word, and the effort to do so tired him. It was easier to slip to other things, away from this cave and the woman who would not stop looking at him. Even she went back to her spot by the fire and laid the metal stick across her lap. He left the cave, left the darkness, and was outside, the sky above him, white as death. Pale thin clouds danced attendance on a silver moon, while 1,000 stars watched coldly. He bounded, beneath the pale shadow of a weirwood armored in ice, and to the vast white wilderness where nothing moved except the blowing snow. How long he lingered there, he could not say. But when he returned to the cave it was to the scent of blood. The other one had returned, the man, and he carried with him the carcasses of 3 rabbits. He placed them by the fire, and as he shook off his cloak, John lunged, taking the prey into his hands, gorging on its flesh with his teeth and lapping its blood, gushing red and hot into his mouth. The man and the woman were staring at him in horror. When he was finished, he threw the bones and the tufts of fur to the ground, and would have taken the rest, but he misliked the gleam of the knife in the man's hand. He didn't use it on him, anyway. Instead, the new arrival silently retreated to where the woman sat, and began to skin the rabbits. When he was done, he spitted the carcasses, banked the fire with a pair of rocks, and balanced them atop it. The smell made his mouth water, but they offered him none. They ate quickly, and left not so much as a scrap. "How is he today?" the man asked. He said needle, and he let me close enough to sew up his wound at last. "You ought to try to sleep, John," the man said, too loudly. "Sleep? Yes, you need rest. We'll watch over you until dawn. Just lay down, and close your eyes." John did as he said. He wiped his mouth on the back of his sleeve and it came away, red again. Afterwards, he lay down on the hard ground and closed his eyes. Sleep did not come, but closing his eyes sharpened his other senses. He could see the world outside the cave as clearly as if he watched it with the eyes of a hawk, and somewhere, so far away, he sensed 5 wolves and felt a deep ache of emptiness and incompleteness. They searched for him too, but he hid away from them, afraid of what they might find, and their cries echoed through the world, long lonely mournful sounds. "We can't go on like this," the man was whispering. "We'll freeze, or starve to death, or be found and killed by the others. We must return to the wall. John needs a maester, or a mage. He's getting better." "No, he's not. He just ate a raw rabbit with nothing but his teeth. He doesn't sleep, he hardly speaks, and each morning we explain who we are only for him to forget again." The man sighed. "You returned from death, too. But you returned whole." "Did I?" "Yes. When I found you on Dragonstone, you were yourself, save for your clothes and a few tufts of hair. What I meant is, did I die? I'm not so certain. The fire should have killed me, but I remember mounting Shadow Tamer, and I remember hunger, and thirst, and pain on Cracklaw Point. But we both saw his wound. John was dead. And perhaps still is. Or at least, his soul is. We've seen strange things since the dragons were born. Perhaps this is one more horror thrust upon us. His dragon still knows him. Bridezan follows wherever he goes, and when she spit her flame on the others as he burned in his pyre, it was to protect him. If only he would mount her, we might have a chance. Even with all our will bent towards them, the dragons still do as they wish. John cannot command Bridezan, even if we were to chain him to his saddle ourselves." The woman sighed. "Then you should go alone, as we discussed." "Nothing has changed, Egon. You must go south, and speak to your uncle and to Lord Tyrell." "No. Everything has changed. Every moment of my hunt I thought of you and what might happen if you were overrun by others, or if some other misfortune found you. I was gone for mere hours. Do you think I could so easily turn south and leave you here in this nameless land? Kingship is no easy thing. John and I are but 2 people. Your realm is made of millions. Mace Tyrell hates me, and my uncle will heed your words as well as he would my own. You fly south, and leave me with John. With what authority should I speak for you?" The woman asked sharply. "It is you who holds this all together. Your heir is an infant boy in Sunspear. Do you not think that frightens all of Westeros? Winter is coming for all of them, Egon. It would hearten the people to see their king, if nothing else. As for me and John, who are we, against that? If we perish, the Night's Watch will elect another Lord Commander, and Robb Stark will wed another woman and make her Lady of Winterfell." Winterfell. John tried the taste of that on his tongue, but no sound came out. He opened his eyes, and turned to face them. They did not seem to sense him. "Robb Stark," Egon repeated. "He hates me worse than Mace. He will have me killed and fed to his wolf if I return with his wife. Now is not the time for japes. It is no jape. Do you think Robb will treat with me if you are not at his side?" The woman was quiet a moment, and frowned. "It doesn't matter if Winterfell resists you. You were right about that, at least. If the cold is half as bad there as it is here, they will be desperate. That is why you must win over Mace, and Prince Doran. March them north, and Robb Stark's hate will not matter." Egon got a stubborn look. "No, I leave with you, or not at all." At last, they seemed to notice him. "John. Why aren't you sleeping?" I. His mouth was dry again. He felt terribly thirsty. "Winterfell." The man and woman exchanged a look. "Winterfell, yes. Do you know of what we speak? Do you remember Winterfell?" When he said nothing, the woman inched closer. "Do you remember your cousin Robb?" Robb. It brought to mind a lean wolf, with smoke-grey fur and yellow eyes. "Dead." She looked startled. "Dead? No. Robb isn't dead. He's with the rest of your cousins and with your mother. And Benjen Stark," your uncle Egon added. "He's a black brother, like you." "Brother? I need water." The man gave him his own water skin. John drank it too quickly, and retched it all back up on the ground. He lay back down after, his head spinning, and a sick feeling growing so fierce inside him that he felt his belly would burst open. He did sleep after, if that was the name for it. In his dream, he walked on 2 feet, not 4, and every step was stalked by white shadows. At the center of it all sat a monster in a weirwood throne, and when it opened its mouth, it screamed, "Bastard!" He ran in the darkness like a drunk, desperate, searching for something, for someone, and when at last a string of light fell from the ceiling, he reached out to clutch it, only to feel the icy blade deep in his heart. Everything was white, then, and silent. He threaded his way through a blizzard, stumbling clumsily through the snowdrifts that threatened to bury him. When he looked up at the pale white sky, snowflakes drifted down upon his eyelids. It didn't matter. He did not feel its cold. He felt nothing at all, save the pain in his chest. He wanted to reach out and tear out the pulsing thing that hurt him so, and he would, but not now. His paws were sinking deep in the snow as he came to the edge of a great precipice. Before him a pass opened up into airy emptiness, and a long V-shaped valley lay spread beneath him like a quilt, awash in white, and blue, and grey. A vast blue-white wall plugged one end of the vale, squeezing between the mountains as if it had shouldered them aside. A river, he thought, a frozen river or ice several thousand feet high. Under that glittering cold cliff was a great lake, its icy surface reflecting the snow-capped peaks that ringed it. Once there were men down in the valley. He was sure of that. A vision of them rose before his eyes then, of a huge host that had once assembled here. Some were tearing great holes in the half-frozen ground, while others trained for war. He watched as a swarming mass of riders charged a shield wall, astride horses no larger than ants. The sound of their mock battle was a rustling of steel leaves, drifting faintly on the wind. Everywhere around them crude earthen shelters and hide tents sprouted haphazardly, like a pox on the face of the earth. He spied untidy mounds of hay, smelled goats and sheep, horses and pigs, dogs in great procession. Tendrils of dark smoke rose from 1,000 cook fires. And then the smoke faded, as though the candle had been blown out, and John reached for his eye, not knowing why, and felt a scar there, and talons, and pain. The wolf is strong. Thorin Half-Hand was standing over him, testing the edge of his sword with the ball of his thumb. John was confused. "I slew you." Half-Hand looked out across the valley, quiet. "You'll bring them down on us." John followed his gaze. A whole army had gathered there, but it was not one made up of men. They were pale as ice, sword-slim and milky white, with armor that rippled and shifted as it moved. Some scuttled up the ice like spiders, others rode on horses and fallen beasts. And he was transformed too. John was armored in black ice, and in his hand a blade burned red in his fist. "John." He turned. The world around him melted away like summer snow, and he was wandering on a field of grass, littered with wild flowers of 1,000 colors, where at its center rose a tower of white stone, crawling with ivy. The sounds of music drifted in from its open windows, sweet at first, and then growing louder and wilder, and shifted and changed and grew shrill as a woman's screams. He put his hands up to his ears to muffle the sound, but it was no use. He needed to go in there, but he didn't want to. Something was waiting for him, and if he met it, he knew it would tear his soul in two. He fought it, and pushed it away, and screamed, but the sound was still in his ears when before him appeared a star in the darkness, and at the center of it, a woman's face, her hair framed by light. A sudden gust of cold swept over him, and the effort of standing became too great an effort for him. He fell into a sleep that was leaden and dreamless, and when he opened his eyes, it felt as though he was flying. Around his waist was tied something heavy, and warm, binding him to the figure who sat before him, silver hair whipping in the moonlight as the air thrilled to the sound of wings. He felt warm, as he had not in weeks, as perhaps he never had before. There was naught but darkness then, for hours, for days, for years, only a dark, endless abyss that was black as pitch. And then light entered, unwanted and unwelcome, and with it, pain, lancing through him. The ground below him was soft. No, not ground, he was in a narrow bed, with furs piled high upon him and a fire burning in the hearth. In a chair by the door sat a boy no older than 12, wearing black, with a too big cloak around his shoulders. When he saw John, his eyes opened wide, and he bolted through the door. The room was poorly furnished, with naught but his bed, and the chair now empty. A cold wind whistled through the window, threatening to tear open the shutters. It seemed almost as though it carried words in it, though in what language he could not name. Slowly, he swung his legs to the side of the bed and took step by clumsy step to the door, like a child still learning to walk, except he had no one to guide him. When he opened the door, the wind gusted around him so fiercely it almost knocked him back into the room, but he pushed on. Vaguely he was aware of eyes on him, but very far off, as though they were spirits, here to attend him. It mattered little. It was the massive wall which he looked to, rising like a mountain high above them. He studied the stone and earth and the runes that had been cut into it, and looked east and west, as far as his eyes can see to where it seemed to shrink, where the mortar that held it together had given way and huge rocks the size of mammoths lay crushed and broken on the ground. It took him a second, a moment, too long, to realize what it was he looked at. The wall, not a wall, and it was not as he had ever seen it. On days when the sun was high in the sky, it would be a crystalline blue, reflecting so brilliantly that it hurt the eyes to look on it. On gloomy days, it seemed a pale cry, pocked and scoured with centuries of wind-blown dirt. It was a colossal white cliff that filled up half the sky, and now. He shivered, at the cold and at the sight. "My lord." A long, lanky young man in black was at his side, throwing his own cloak over John's shoulders. It was then for the first time that he realized he was naked. The man's eyes lingered a moment too long on his scar, and then quickly away. "The air is cold enough to freeze a man's blood in his veins out here. Come, I'll take you back to your room." He let himself be led. The world had become clearer. The ghosts which had looked at him before wore black clothes, or else they were women, holding spears and swords with their faces covered in scarves. He knew that each was familiar to him, if not by name then by sight, but was unsure why, or how it mattered. Clothes were waiting for him in his room, folded upon his bed, and he dressed himself as the man spoke of their numbers and their supplies, and what ravens had been sent, and which had returned, and Lord this and King that, until John's head was swimming. And then the man fell quiet, and stood looking at John as though he were waiting for an answer to something. Ghost was the word that came from his lips. The man frowned, confused, and then understood quickly. "We've had no sight of the direwolf, Lord Commander. No doubt he'll turn up soon now that you're here." John found his words then, and once they were on his tongue, he could not think of how he had lost them before. "I must find him. Saddle a horse for me. No one is to ride out alone. We must save the strength of the horses. His Grace has commanded it. Take me to King Roriger." The man frowned. Iron Emmett, John remembered suddenly. They had been friends, once. The king who gave the command is Egon, my lord, the sixth of his name. King Roriger fell in Castle Black. Your brother means to lead a retreat. He says the wall cannot be held. John remembered, he remembered, a great dragon, and women fleeing, and his father, burning in a pyre. He had looked noble even in death. "Kinslayer," a voice that was not his own crept into his ear. "I have no brothers, save you." Old words, and they came to him quickly. Emmett looked at him, and then nodded. "Well, His Grace will be wanting to see you, no doubt of that. I'll have a steward fetch you your supper. Unless you'd like to eat with us in the hall." John thought of all the eyes watching him and shook his head. He was alone only a moment then, before the women burst in, breathless and flushed with red cheeks, dressed like a boy. "John!" She called out and embraced him fiercely. "I thought you were. Well, I'm glad you're awake. We've all been waiting for you." He drew away. "Do you remember me?" "Yes," he found himself saying. "Daenerys." She smiled and repeated his words, "Yes. Daenerys." Speaking so much had tired him. It felt strange, foreign. "Where are we?" "Long Barrow." "The wall." She nodded, grim-faced. "No one can say what happened, only that when we flew north on our dragons, sheets of ice began to fall off it. And slowly each day, it grew worse and worse, until all the dirt and rock were laid bare. The ice that held the gates has melted around it. The Black Brothers have made a barrier, but they say it will not hold." The words washed over him, but in his heart, he felt nothing, only numb, only cold. John sat back on the bed, raised his hand towards his chest, and then thought better of it and brought it to his side. "I need a horse. I need to leave this place. Daenerys repeated what Emmett had told him, that they would be leaving, that ravens had been sent to every castle on the wall to marshal a retreat south. No. No retreat. I need Ghost. There is nothing to do but retreat. She sat on the bed beside him, and looked at her fingers. I'm sorry, Jon. Nothing has ended up as we thought. But even the wildlings say the dead aren't rising anymore. One of your black brothers died of fever, and the women took his body north of the wall and watched over him to be certain, but he never woke. There may be hope, yet. We weakened them, if nothing else.